The story of Babylon begins in the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, where rivers determined the fate of civilizations, and where human ingenuity turned floodplains into fields capable of sustaining cities. Long before Babylon emerged as a name spoken across the ancient world, the lands of Sumer had already given shape to what would become the foundation of Babylonian identity. The earliest towns of Ur, Uruk, and Eridu laid out patterns of urban life, temple organization, and social hierarchy that Babylon would inherit and expand. The innovations of the Sumerians in writing, irrigation, and religious architecture created a world in which Babylon could rise, and the very soil of the region bore the imprint of centuries of cultural experiments that preceded it. Babylon's origins were modest. Archaeological traces suggest that by the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, it was still only a small settlement, overshadowed by more powerful neighbours. It lay near the Euphrates, positioned within the complex network of canals that tied Mesopotamian life to the management of water. These channels not only sustained agriculture, but also defined political boundaries and shaped rivalries, as control over water was control over survival. Babylon began as one among many competing centres, but geography gave it both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Situated where trade routes converged, it offered access to the movement of goods and ideas, yet it also placed the settlement within reach of larger powers that alternated between alliances and domination. The Sumerians had already created myths of divine order, written codes of kingship, and systems of temple-centered economies, and when the Akkadian Empire under Sargon spread across Mesopotamia, Babylon existed in the shadow of those great forces. The collapse of Akkadian power under pressure from internal instability and invasions opened the way for smaller states to assert themselves, and Babylon was among those that would seize the chance. Early rulers in the region traced legitimacy through both Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, showing how Babylon's culture was never purely one or the other, but a blend of influences that defined it from the start. The city's Semitic-speaking population carried forward Akkadian language forms, while also preserving Sumerian religious vocabulary in temples and schools, ensuring that Babylon stood as a cultural inheritor rather than a cultural break. Archaeological layers from this formative period show modest houses constructed of mud brick, narrow streets winding between simple dwellings, and the earliest outlines of temples that would one day become monumental. Clay tablets written in cuneiform already appear, recording mundane details of rations, trade, and offerings to gods whose names echo across centuries. In these early tablets, one sees how religion, economy, and administration were inseparable. Priests measured barley, scribes recorded transactions, and kings presented themselves as chosen guardians of divine order. Babylon's first steps toward prominence came through this interweaving of sacred and practical, a formula that would endure through its long history. By the time of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, Babylon had been incorporated into larger political frameworks. The rulers of Ur extended their authority across much of Mesopotamia, and Babylon was drawn into their orbit as a subordinate city. Records from this period show Babylon paying tribute, supplying troops, and contributing labour to projects that symbolised Ur's supremacy. Yet the collapse of Ur around 2000 BCE, brought about by invasions from groups such as the Elamites and the Amorites, created the vacuum in which Babylon's destiny would change. What had been a provincial settlement became the base for new leaders who emerged from the Amorite tribes moving into Mesopotamia. These newcomers would leave a permanent mark on Babylon, for it was from their ranks that Hammurabi, the first great king of Babylon, would eventually rise. The Amorites were semi-nomadic in origin, known in earlier texts as outsiders to the Sumerian cities. Over time, they settled in urban centres and assimilated to Mesopotamian culture, but their mobility and tribal connections gave them advantages in an era of shifting alliances and collapsing empires. They established dynasties and cities across Mesopotamia, including Larsa, Isin, and Babylon. In Babylon, an Amorite chieftain named Sumuabum founded a line of rulers that would set the stage for expansion. His successors, while not yet dominant over Mesopotamia, began consolidating power locally. building fortifications and strengthening Babylon's institutions. The city transitioned from an ordinary town into a royal seat, and its rulers started to claim divine favour as their justification for authority. The interplay of continuity and innovation defined Babylon's birth. On one hand, the city adopted long-established traditions of Mesopotamian kingship. Rulers built temples dedicated to gods with Sumerian origins, employed scribes trained in centuries-old cuneiform techniques, and organised economies around temple estates and agricultural surpluses. On the other hand, the Amorite dynasty introduced new political strategies, emphasising military campaigns to secure territory, forging alliances across fragmented states, and presenting the king as a central unifying figure in ways that Sumerian city-states had not. This combination of old and new allowed Babylon to emerge as a unique power rather than a mere successor to earlier cities. Daily life in early Babylon reveals much about its trajectory. Farmers cultivated barley, dates and legumes in irrigated fields beyond the city walls, using techniques that had been perfected for centuries. Herds of sheep and goats provided wool and meat, while fish from the Euphrates supplemented diets. Inside the city, artisans crafted pottery, textiles, and metal tools, feeding an economy that connected to distant trade networks. Merchants exchanged goods with regions as far as Anatolia, the Persian Gulf, and the Iranian plateau. Clay tablets reveal contracts, debts, and exchanges, all recorded meticulously, showing how commerce thrived alongside temple rituals. Families lived in modest compounds, with extended kin often sharing space, while education was the preserve of scribble schools that trained future administrators in the demanding script of cuneiform. Religious life tied the city together. Temples were not only places of worship but also centres of economic activity. Priests oversaw offerings to deities, maintained sacred festivals, and managed temple lands worked by dependents. The early Babylonian pantheon already included deities that would later dominate Mesopotamian religion, such as Marduk, who at first held a minor role but would eventually rise to supremacy. Other gods, including Shamash the sun god, Ishtar the goddess of love and war, and Ea the god of wisdom, received offerings and devotion, binding the population through rituals that reaffirmed cosmic order. Festivals punctuated the calendar, bringing communities together to celebrate divine cycles that mirrored the rhythms of agricultural life. The political landscape of Mesopotamia during this period was fragmented. Cities like Larsa, Isin, Eshnunna, and Mari vied for supremacy, and alliances shifted constantly. Babylon's rulers maneuvered within this volatile environment, sometimes allying with stronger states, sometimes asserting independence through military action. The city's rise was not inevitable, but it was facilitated by the skill of its leaders in exploiting the weakness of rivals. Step by step, Babylon gained territory and influence, and by the early 18th century BCE, it stood on the verge of becoming the dominant power of Mesopotamia. The foundation had been laid for Hammurabi to transform Babylon from a regional kingdom into an empire that would set standards remembered for millennia. What began as a small settlement in the shadow of older cities was now poised to become the heart of a new political and cultural order. The confluence of Sumerian traditions, Akkadian influence, and Amorite ambition produced a city uniquely prepared to take the lead. Its institutions were mature, its rulers increasingly confident, and its gods positioned to claim supreme authority. From these beginnings, the stage was set for the figure who would define Babylon's identity and inscribe its name permanently into the history of civilizations. When Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon in the early 18th century BCE, he inherited a kingdom that was growing but still fragile, surrounded by rivals and dependent on careful maneuvering to maintain its independence. His reign, traditionally dated from 1792 to 1750 BCE, would mark a turning point in Mesopotamian history. He was not the founder of Babylon, nor the first Amorite king to rule there, but he was the one who elevated the city from a regional power into the dominant force across Mesopotamia. His name has endured because of both his political and military accomplishments and the enduring codification of law associated with him, which gave Babylonian kingship a foundation that would be remembered for thousands of years. The early years of Hammurabi's rule were defined by caution and consolidation. Babylon was one of many Amorite-ruled states competing in Mesopotamia at the time. Larsa, under the powerful Rimsin, dominated the south. Eshnunna held influence in the Diyala region. Mari, with its palace of unparalleled splendour, controlled routes to Syria, and Assur in the north was beginning to reassert itself as a trading power. In this crowded political landscape, Babylon was not yet the strongest state, and Hammurabi initially avoided reckless expansion. Instead, he concentrated on strengthening the city's defences, improving its irrigation systems, and presenting himself as a just and capable ruler. Surviving inscriptions show him engaging in projects that both benefited the population materially and reinforced his legitimacy as king chosen by the gods. One of Hammurabi's most notable domestic achievements was his attention to water management. Mesopotamian civilization depended on irrigation, and the maintenance of canals, levees and dikes was both a technical and political necessity. Neglect of water systems could lead to famine, flooding, or social unrest, while their careful upkeep ensured prosperity. Hammurabi's inscriptions describe how he restored canals, regulated their flow, and secured farmland against the unpredictability of the rivers. These projects not only sustained agriculture, but also projected the image of a king who cared for his people and ensured divine order on earth. In a world where kingship was justified as service to the gods, particularly Marduk in Babylon's case, these undertakings were as much acts of piety as they were of governance. Hammurabi's role as judge also became central to his reputation. Early in his reign, he cultivated an image of fairness and diligence in settling disputes. Mesopotamian kings had long served as ultimate arbiters of justice, but Hammurabi emphasized this duty with greater clarity than many before him. He issued decrees to regulate prices, wages, and contracts, intervening in the economic life of the kingdom to maintain balance. His actions laid the groundwork for what would later be formalized in his Great Code. But even before that famous inscription, he was already shaping the idea that a Babylonian king was not merely a warrior or a temple builder, but the guarantor of justice itself. As Hammurabi secured his base, he began to expand. His military campaigns were gradual and calculated. He formed alliances with stronger powers when necessary, especially with Shamshi-Adad of Assyria, a ruler whose ambition extended across northern Mesopotamia. Their temporary cooperation allowed Hammurabi to strengthen Babylon without immediately confronting overwhelming enemies. Yet as time passed, the balance of power shifted. Shamshi-Adad's death weakened Assyria, and the rivalries among the Amorite kings created opportunities for Babylon to assert itself. Hammurabi's strategy combined diplomacy and force, using treaties when advantageous and arms when rivals faltered. His victories accumulated steadily. He defeated Eshnunna, securing the vital Diyala region and its trade routes. He turned against Mari, conquering the city that had once been a glittering ally, absorbing its resources and territory into his growing domain. He clashed with Rimsin of Larsa, whose long reign had dominated the south, and after prolonged conflict, Hammurabi triumphed, bringing Larsa into Babylon's orbit. Each conquest not only expanded territory but also shifted Babylon's prestige, until by the later years of his reign, Hammurabi ruled nearly all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the north of Assyria. The old Babylonian Empire had been born. The expansion was not purely military. Hammurabi understood that empire required administration. Newly conquered regions had to be integrated into a coherent system, and this was accomplished through governors, loyal officials, and the reinforcement of Babylonian culture. Temples were restored in conquered cities, and Hammurabi presented himself as the protector of their gods. ensuring that local populations saw him as legitimate. Letters from his reign reveal him corresponding with governors and officials about matters ranging from troop movements to disputes over property, showing a ruler deeply engaged in the practical details of governance. The culmination of Hammurabi's vision was the great legal inscription that would become known as the Code of Hammurabi. Carved onto a tall stele of black diorite, the text was displayed publicly, not to create new laws from nothing but to compile and proclaim the principles of justice by which the king ruled. At its top, Hammurabi is depicted receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god and divine judge, a symbolic representation of how his laws were rooted in divine will. The inscription itself covers nearly 300 specific provisions, dealing with matters such as property, trade, marriage, inheritance, labour and crime. The laws reveal much about Babylonian society. They distinguish between classes, with different penalties for free citizens, dependents and slaves, reflecting the stratified nature of Mesopotamian life. They address the responsibilities of builders, the rights of merchants, the duties of farmers, and the obligations of family members. Punishments range from fines to physical retaliation, embodying the principle of lex talionis, the law of retribution. While harsh by modern standards, these laws sought to establish consistency and predictability, ensuring that justice was not arbitrary, but rooted in an order visible to all. The very act of inscribing the laws in stone had profound significance. In a society where writing was the preserve of scribes, the monumental display of laws symbolized permanence and authority. Even if few Babylonians could read the cuneiform themselves, the sight of the stele and the knowledge of its existence communicated the message that justice was enshrined in a visible, lasting form. Hammurabi thereby placed himself in history not merely as a conqueror, but as a lawgiver, aligning his rule with cosmic principles of order. Hammurabi's empire, though vast, was not eternal. After his death in 1750 BCE, his successors struggled to maintain the same degree of control. The challenges of governing distant territories, the resurgence of rivals, and the natural difficulties of empire led to fragmentation. Within a century, the old Babylonian Empire would wane, and new powers, including the Hittites and Kassites, would shape Mesopotamia. Yet Hammurabi's reign left an enduring template. His model of kingship, combining military might, administrative order, and codified justice, remained central to how later rulers defined themselves. The memory of Hammurabi persisted not only in the continuation of Babylon as a city of importance, but also in the transmission of his laws. Copies of the code were preserved in scribal schools for centuries, influencing legal thought throughout the Near East. Even when Babylon's empire faded, the image of Hammurabi as a just ruler chosen by the gods remained part of the cultural fabric. His reign marked the moment when Babylon's name ceased to be that of a minor city and instead became synonymous with law, kingship, and empire. As the old Babylonian period gave way to centuries of change, Babylon itself would face conquest, decline, and renewal. Yet the foundations laid under Hammurabi endured, for he had demonstrated how a city once modest could command the allegiance of Mesopotamia, and how kingship could be justified not only by conquest, but by the visible administration of justice. The city that he transformed would continue to evolve, shaped by foreign rulers and shifting powers, but always carrying within it the memory of its first great king. From his reign forward, Babylon would never again be forgotten, and the traditions he established would prepare it for the next phases of its long and complex history. The monument that secured Hammurabi's name in the history of law was not merely a collection of rules, but a carefully constructed declaration of kingship, religion, and social order. The stone stele on which his laws were inscribed, standing nearly 7 feet tall, survives as one of the most famous artifacts from the ancient world. Carved in diorite, a material chosen for its permanence, it presented to Babylonians and to posterity the principle that justice was not arbitrary, but anchored in divine will. The relief at its top shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god who also embodied the role of judge, with the king receiving authority from the deity. This visual message was as important as the words beneath it, for it made clear that Hammurabi did not invent justice but rather carried out a divine mandate to ensure order on earth. The text beneath the image opens with a prologue in which Hammurabi declares his legitimacy and mission. He names the gods who granted him power, particularly Anu and Enlil, and emphasises Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, as the one who entrusted him with kingship. He presents himself as the protector of the weak, the defender of widows and orphans, and the one who brings order where chaos might otherwise prevail. This was not a mere literary flourish, but a claim with deep political weight. By aligning his authority with divine command and by framing his mission as one of justice rather than conquest alone, Hammurabi gave his rule a moral dimension that resonated with his subjects and reinforced his legitimacy across conquered territories. The laws themselves number close to 300 and cover an extraordinary range of social and economic life. They are written in Akkadian using cuneiform script, and although often referred to as a code in modern terms, they do not form a systematic legal code in the sense of modern legislation. Instead, they are a compilation of rulings, precedents, and principles that together provided a framework for legal practice. Many are formulated in conditional statements. If a man does this, then this will be the consequence, suggesting that they were meant as guides for judges and officials, rather than as laws to be read directly by the populace. One of the striking features of the text is the differentiation between social classes. Babylonian society recognized distinctions between the Awilu, or free citizens of higher status, the Mushkenu, who occupied a lower but still free status, and the Wardu, or slaves. The laws prescribe different penalties depending on the class of both perpetrator and victim. For instance, if a nobleman destroyed the eye of another nobleman, the penalty was the destruction of his own eye. If the victim was of lower status, however, the penalty might instead be a fine in silver. This tiered system illustrates both the hierarchy of Babylonian society and the attempt to balance justice with social realities. The principle of retribution, often summarized as an eye for an eye, appears prominently in the text, but it coexists with other forms of justice such as fines, compensation, and restoration. Theft, fraud, and negligence are treated seriously, with penalties intended not only to punish, but also to deter and to uphold trust within society. Builders who constructed unsafe houses could be held personally liable for the consequences, including death if their negligence caused fatality. Merchants who engaged in unfair practices faced restitution or worse. The laws thus recognized the complexity of an economy in which trade, property, and contracts played central roles. Family law occupies a significant portion of the text, reflecting the importance of kinship in Babylonian society. The laws address marriage contracts, dowries, inheritance, and the rights and duties of husbands, wives, and children. Marriage was not only a personal union, but also an economic arrangement, and the code sought to regulate it to prevent disputes. It set guidelines for divorce, stipulating conditions under which a husband could dismiss a wife and the compensation she would receive, as well as the rights of women to leave husbands under certain circumstances. Inheritance laws sought to protect children and ensure continuity of property, specifying shares for sons and provisions for daughters. The regulations reveal a patriarchal society, but one in which women did have defined rights, and their protection was a concern of the king. The text also reveals the close relationship between religion and law. Temples and priests played significant roles in Babylonian life, and oaths sworn before gods were binding. False testimony or perjury was considered not just a crime against society, but an offence against the divine order. The laws regulating priests, temple property, and sacrificial offerings show how justice extended into the religious sphere, ensuring that the gods received what was due to them and that their representatives acted with integrity. In this way, the legal system reinforced the inseparability of divine and human order. One of the most enduring aspects of Hammurabi's laws is the vision they convey of kingship. The epilogue to the text returns to the theme of the king as protector of the weak and guardian of justice. Hammurabi declares that his words will remain for all time, that future kings should heed them, and that the oppressed may come before his monument to read his laws and find reassurance. The claim is at once political propaganda and a profound statement about the role of the king. By inscribing his authority in stone and declaring it eternal, Hammurabi positioned himself not only as a ruler of his own era, but as a figure whose justice would endure beyond his lifetime. The presence of the steelely in public space, likely set up in Babylon itself and possibly in other cities, created a visible reminder of order. Most Babylonians could not read the cuneiform text, but the steelely stood as a symbol of law and justice that could be pointed to, recited by officials, and invoked in disputes. Its very physicality reinforced the permanence of the king's authority. Even when the empire fractured after Hammurabi's death, the memory of his laws remained. The steelely itself was eventually carried off to Susa by the Elamites in the 12th century BCE, but by then copies had circulated, and the text entered the corpus of Mesopotamian literature studied in scribal schools. The survival of the laws in later centuries ensured their influence. Students copied them as exercises, and judges drew upon them as precedents, even when the political power of Babylon waned. Other Mesopotamian legal traditions, such as those of the Middle Assyrian laws and Hittite laws, show parallels in style and content, suggesting that Hammurabi's text set a model for the genre. Its fame in modern times stems in part from its rediscovery, but its ancient legacy was real, for it represented the idea that law could be made visible, organised, and tied explicitly to the authority of the king under divine sanction. The laws also provide insight into economic life. Provisions regulating interest rates, loans, and debt slavery show the challenges of managing an economy where agriculture was vulnerable to fluctuations and where borrowing was common. The code set maximum interest rates, limited the conditions under which debtors could be enslaved, and provided protections against exploitation. These measures suggest an awareness of the dangers of economic instability and an attempt by the state to maintain balance between creditors and debtors. In doing so, the laws reflect the integration of economic justice into the broader concept of kingship. Beyond economics, the laws reveal the centrality of agriculture to Babylonian society. Regulations addressed irrigation disputes, land leases, and the responsibilities of tenant farmers. The careful articulation of duties in maintaining canals and fields demonstrates the recognition that agricultural productivity was the foundation of the state's prosperity. Disputes over water rights could quickly escalate into larger conflicts, and the laws sought to resolve them within a framework of justice, thereby protecting the stability of the entire kingdom. Criminal law within the text also illustrates the seriousness with which order was protected. Theft, assault, and fraud were punished severely, reflecting the fragility of social trust in a society where survival depended on cooperation. Banditry was a constant threat in rural areas, and the laws made local officials responsible for preventing it, thereby spreading accountability across society. False accusations were punished by imposing on the accuser the penalty intended for the accused, a deterrent against misuse of justice. Such provisions demonstrate both the severity and the sophistication of Babylonian legal thought. The combination of retributive justice, economic regulation, and protection of the vulnerable created a coherent vision of society under divine order. Hammurabi's laws were not utopian, nor did they erase inequality, but they provided structure and predictability. In doing so, they reinforced the king's role as mediator between gods and people, responsible for ensuring that the weak were not oppressed by the strong. The code was as much a political document as a legal one, projecting Hammurabi's image as the shepherd of his people and the executor of divine will. The influence of this legal tradition extended beyond Mesopotamia. Later cultures in the Near East adopted similar formulations of laws, and echoes of its principles can be found in texts of the Hebrew Bible and in Greco-Roman legal thought. While direct lines of transmission are debated, the idea that law should be codified, publicly proclaimed, and grounded in higher authority resonates across civilizations. Hammurabi's stele thus stands not only as an artifact of ancient Mesopotamia, but as a milestone in the history of law itself. As Babylon moved beyond Hammurabi's reign, the empire he had forged began to weaken, but the concept of law as divine mandate remained embedded in its culture. Successors would struggle to hold territory, foreign powers would invade, and the city would pass through cycles of decline and renewal. Yet the stele's black surface, with its carved words and solemn image of king and god, continued to speak of an ideal. Babylon's identity had been forever tied to the vision of law as the expression of cosmic order, and that vision would accompany it through centuries of transformation. When Hammurabi's conquest had expanded Babylon into the centre of a new political order, the life of its people continued to unfold within rhythms of work, worship, and family that defined the old Babylonian world. Beneath the monumental inscriptions and grand claims of kingship, everyday existence was shaped by the flow of the Euphrates, the fertility of the fields, and the structures of community that tied individuals into larger networks of obligation and identity. The kingdom that Hammurabi had built and his successors attempted to preserve was not only an empire of territory but also a society with intricate economic systems and cultural patterns. To understand what it meant to live in Babylon during this period is to look beyond the walls of palaces and temples into the streets, markets, farms and households where thousands of lives intersected. The geography of Mesopotamia remained the determining factor of life. The Euphrates coursed through the land, its waters distributed by canals that had to be constantly maintained. Agriculture depended on irrigation, and without collective effort, the system collapsed. Fields of barley stretched outward from the city, providing the staple grain that sustained the population. Date palms grew in groves along canals, producing fruit, fibre and timber. Sheep and goats grazed where land permitted, supplying wool for textiles, which were among Babylon's most important trade goods. These patterns of agriculture were not new, but under Babylonian administration, they were integrated into larger systems of taxation and redistribution, binding rural producers to the city through obligations to temples and the crown. Urban life revolved around the interaction between families, neighbourhoods and institutions. Houses were built of mud brick, the ever-present material of Mesopotamia, and arranged along narrow lanes. Courtyards provided space for cooking, storage, and small-scale production. Families often lived in extended households, with multiple generations sharing space. Property records from cuneiform tablets show how land and houses were inherited, divided, and sold, revealing the constant negotiation between kinship obligations and economic opportunity. The household formed the basic unit of society, but it was embedded in broader frameworks of clan and community that provided identity and support. The market provided a lively setting for exchange. Goods flowed into the city from surrounding fields and distant lands alike. Farmers brought grain, dates and vegetables. Herders offered wool, hides and meat. Artisans displayed pottery, tools and textiles. Merchants facilitated long-distance trade, moving Babylonian products to regions as distant as Anatolia, and returning with metals, timber and luxury goods. Silver functioned as the primary standard of value, though barter was common. Contracts inscribed on clay tablets recorded agreements in precise terms, specifying quantities, qualities, and repayment conditions. These contracts demonstrate not only the sophistication of the economy, but also the central role of trust and accountability. Oaths sworn before gods reinforced promises, reminding participants that economic behaviour was tied to divine as well as human order. Labour in Babylon was diverse. Free citizens worked their own fields or engaged in crafts and trade. Dependents served temples or estates, bound by obligations that tied them to institutions in exchange for protection and sustenance. Slaves, though a minority of the population, contributed significant labour, whether as household servants, agricultural workers, or skilled specialists. Slavery in Babylon often resulted from debt, war, or crime, and those slaves were property in legal terms. They could marry, own possessions, and sometimes purchase their freedom. The presence of different forms of labour reflected the hierarchical nature of society, but all contributed to the functioning of the economy and the maintenance of urban life. Temples played a dual role as religious centres and economic institutions. Each major city had its patron deity, and in Babylon, the Temple of Marduk would eventually dominate, though other gods received their share of devotion. Temples owned land, employed workers, and managed resources. They received offerings, not only in grain and animals, but also in craft goods and silver, which sustained elaborate rituals throughout the year. Priests, scribes, and labourers all depended on temple institutions, which in turn connected divine worship with practical administration. Records from temple archives reveal the scale of these operations, with thousands of animals sacrificed annually and countless transactions recorded in careful detail. Religion infused daily life beyond the temple walls. Families maintained household shrines, offering food and drink to protective deities. Festivals brought communities together in celebration and ritual, marking the cycles of seasons and reinforcing social bonds. Divination was a constant presence, as people sought to discern the will of the gods through signs in the heavens, the flight of birds, or the patterns of oil poured into water. Dreams were interpreted as messages from deities, and professional diviners provided guidance in matters ranging from agriculture to warfare. The belief that the divine realm permeated every aspect of existence ensured that personal choices, political actions, and economic decisions were all framed within a sacred order. Education and literacy played crucial roles in sustaining this order. Scribal schools trained young men in the complex art of cuneiform writing, a skill that required years of practice. Students copied lexical lists, proverbs, hymns, and legal texts, gradually mastering the thousands of signs and their combinations. Literacy was limited to a small elite, but its influence was profound. Scribes not only recorded economic transactions, but also preserved literature, composed hymns, and transmitted knowledge in mathematics and astronomy. Through their work, the cultural memory of Mesopotamia was maintained, and Babylon became one of the leading centres of learning in the ancient Near East. The social hierarchy was clearly defined. At the top stood the king, presented as chosen by the gods to shepherd his people. Below him were officials, priests, and wealthy landowners who managed estates and influenced policy. Free citizens formed the majority, engaged in farming, trade, and craft. Dependents tied to temples or estates occupied a lower tier, followed by slaves whose status was lowest, but not entirely without rights. The legal distinctions between these groups were evident in Hammurabi's code and other documents, which specified different penalties and privileges according to status. This hierarchy created order, but also tension, as economic pressures could push free citizens into dependence or slavery, while others rose through service, trade, or royal favour. Art and culture flourished within this context. Cylinder seals, carved with intricate images, served both as signatures and as miniature works of art. Pottery and textiles displayed patterns that reflected both local traditions and influences from trade. Music and storytelling enlivened festivals and domestic life. The great epics and myths of Mesopotamia were copied and adapted, with the Epic of Gilgamesh circulating widely in Old Babylonian versions. These texts preserved not only entertainment but also moral and theological lessons, teaching about the relationship between humans and gods, the nature of kingship, and the inevitability of death. Justice, as articulated in Hammurabi's laws, permeated everyday life. Courts functioned in cities and villages, with elders or officials presiding over cases. witnesses testified, contracts were produced, and oaths sworn. Punishments were severe, but the goal was to maintain order and deter wrongdoing. The presence of the law in public consciousness meant that disputes were often resolved through negotiation and settlement rather than violence, for the authority of the king's justice stood behind every transaction. In this way, society functioned within a framework that balanced personal initiative with collective responsibility. Economic archives from the period provide remarkable detail. Tablets from merchants record loans, trade expeditions and partnerships. Agricultural records track the yield of fields and the distribution of rations. Household archives preserve family disputes over inheritance, dowries and property. These documents, mundane as they may seem, reveal the texture of life more vividly than royal inscriptions. They show fathers arranging marriages for daughters, brothers disputing boundaries of fields, and merchants calculating profits. They demonstrate how law, economy, and family intertwined to shape the lives of ordinary Babylonians. Foreign relations added another dimension to this world. Babylon's position in Mesopotamia placed it at the crossroads of trade and diplomacy. Alliances with neighbouring states, rivalries over territory, and exchanges of goods and ideas tied the city to wider networks. Letters preserved in archives show rulers addressing one another with a mixture of formality and pragmatism, offering daughters in marriage, requesting troops, or demanding repayment of debts. These interactions reveal the interconnectedness of the region, with Babylon both influencing and being influenced by the currents of politics and culture beyond its walls. The old Babylonian world was not free from hardship. Drought, flood and disease posed constant threats. War brought destruction, displacement, and enslavement. Economic pressures could ruin families, forcing them into debt bondage. Yet resilience characterized the population. Families adapted, communities supported one another, and institutions provided stability. Temples and laws offered frameworks of meaning and order, even when circumstances were harsh. In this balance between fragility and endurance, Babylonian society displayed both vulnerability and strength, qualities that would carry it through centuries of change. As Hammurabi's empire weakened after his death, the structures of daily life persisted. Successors might lose territory, foreign powers might press into Mesopotamia, but the rhythms of farming, trade, worship and family continued. The old Babylonian world thus represents not only an era of political power, but also a snapshot of how people lived, worked, and believed. Their houses, contracts, and prayers tell as much about Babylon's legacy as the conquest of kings. In the continuity of these practices, Babylon remained more than an empire. It was a civilization sustained by the labour, faith, and resilience of its people. The stage was set for transformations that would come with new dynasties, foreign conquerors, and shifting centres of power. Yet the patterns established in this period, the integration of law, religion, economy and society, would remain the bedrock of Babylonian identity. The city would endure challenges and absorb influences, but its life would continue to be structured around the principles and practices that had taken shape in these formative centuries. From this base, Babylon would move forward into new phases of history, carrying with it the imprint of the old Babylonian world. In Babylon, the visible skyline was dominated not only by the walls that defended the city, or the palaces where kings resided, but also by the temples that proclaimed the presence of the gods on earth. These structures were more than religious monuments. They were the very heart of Mesopotamian civilization, serving as places of worship, centres of economic management, and symbols of divine order. To understand Babylon is to understand the role of its temples and the priests who sustained them, for within these institutions the lines between the sacred and the practical disappeared. Every offering, every ritual, every administrative record written on clay connected heaven to earth in a system that gave legitimacy to kingship, stability to society, and meaning to the lives of ordinary people. The Temple of Marduk, which would later come to dominate Babylon's religious life, was the most famous, but it was not the only sacred precinct. From early on, Babylon, like other Mesopotamian cities, housed shrines dedicated to multiple deities, each with its own sphere of influence, priesthood, and rituals. Shamash, the sun god, received offerings for justice and truth. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, inspired devotion through ceremonies that reflected her dual nature. Ea, god of wisdom and water, held his place within the pantheon. These temples were woven into the fabric of the city, standing as visible reminders that the gods resided not in distant heavens, but among the people, demanding honour and guiding fate. The structure of the temples reflected both religious symbolism and practical function. Built of mud brick with monumental facades, they often rose on raised platforms, symbolising the cosmic mountain that connected earth to heaven. Within their courtyards, altars and offering tables were placed for daily rituals. Inner chambers housed the cult statues of the gods, carved or moulded images that were treated as living beings. Priests washed, clothed and fed these statues each day, presenting food, drink and incense in ceremonies that sustained the deity's presence. The belief was not symbolic, but literal. The god inhabited the statue, and the rituals provided the nourishment that allowed divine power to remain manifest in the city. The priesthood formed a complex hierarchy. At the top were the high priests, often chosen from prominent families and sometimes linked by kinship to the royal house. Beneath them served a range of specialised officials, each with distinct roles. Some were responsible for sacrifices, others for chanting hymns, others for interpreting omens. Musicians, singers and temple servants filled the courtyards with sound during festivals, while scribes recorded offerings, expenditures and ritual texts. The temple functioned like a small city within the city, employing large numbers of people and coordinating resources from across the land. The priests, therefore, were not only mediators with the divine, but also administrators, managers and educators. Temples controlled extensive landholdings. Fields, orchards and pastures belonged to the gods, worked by dependents who delivered their produce as offerings. These estates generated the wealth needed to sustain elaborate rituals, maintain buildings, and support the large number of personnel attached to the temple. Surviving records from temple archives detail the distribution of grain, the herds of sheep, and the flocks of goats dedicated to sacrificial use. Thousands of animals could be consumed in a year's cycle of offerings, demonstrating the scale at which temples operated. These resources also allowed temples to act as centres of redistribution, providing rations to workers and sustenance during lean years, further strengthening their position in society. Festivals brought the role of temples most vividly to life. The calendar was filled with ceremonial days when statues of gods were paraded through the streets, hymns were sung, and communities gathered to witness the renewal of cosmic order. Among the most important was the New Year festival, the Akitu, which symbolized the reaffirmation of kingship and divine authority. During this festival, the statue of Marduk was carried in procession. The king underwent rituals of humility and renewal, and the people participated in celebrations that bound them together in recognition of the god's supremacy. The Akitu was not simply a religious observance, but a political act, reminding all that the king ruled by divine appointment and that the fate of the land was tied to the favour of its gods. Divination was another central function of the temples. The belief that the gods communicated their will through signs meant that priests were constantly engaged in interpreting the world around them. The examination of animal entrails, the patterns of smoke, the movement of stars, and the appearance of unusual natural phenomena all served as mediums of divine communication. Priests trained for years in these arts, memorizing long series of omens and their interpretations. Kings consulted them before embarking on campaigns. Merchants sought their guidance before journeys, and farmers looked to them for predictions of harvests. Through divination, the temples extended their influence into every corner of society, shaping decisions large and small. The connection between kings and temples was vital. A king who neglected the gods risked losing legitimacy, while one who honoured them gained divine favour. Hammurabi and his successors rebuilt temples, endowed them with land, and participated in rituals, thereby displaying their piety. In return, the priest proclaimed the god's support for the king, embedding political authority within a sacred framework. Inscriptions often emphasize this connection, presenting kings as chosen shepherds who cared for their people on behalf of the gods. This relationship between throne and altar ensured that political and religious power were inseparable, each reinforcing the other in the maintenance of order. Education within the temple sphere ensured the transmission of knowledge. Scribal schools attached to temples taught students to write, read, and calculate. Texts preserved from these schools include hymns, myths, legal collections, and mathematical problems, showing the breadth of the curriculum. Priests required literacy to perform rituals, recite incantations, and maintain records, and scribes trained within temples carried their skills into administration, law, and diplomacy. The temple was therefore not only a place of worship, but also a centre of learning, shaping the intellectual life of Babylon as much as its spiritual practices. The visual culture of temples reinforced their authority. Walls were decorated with reliefs, cylinder seals bore images of deities, and statues of gods and kings alike proclaimed divine presence. The use of symbols such as the sun disk of Shamash or the horned crown of divinity communicated messages understood across the population. These images were not simply decorative but conveyed theological truths and social hierarchies. They reminded worshippers that they lived in a world where gods governed destiny, and that the temple stood as the axis between the human and the divine. For ordinary people, interaction with the temple was a daily reality. Farmers brought offerings from their harvests, artisans contributed their work, and families participated in festivals. Individuals also turned to temples in times of need, offering prayers for healing, fertility, or protection. Priests performed incantations, prepared amulets, and prescribed rituals to ward off evil spirits. In this way, the temple was both a public institution and a personal refuge, serving the community while addressing the private concerns of its members. The bond between worshippers and the temple reinforced loyalty, not only to the gods but to the city itself, for the well-being of Babylon was inseparable from the favour of its divine patrons. The economic role of temples cannot be overstated. They acted as banks, lending silver and grain, recording contracts and managing estates. Merchants deposited goods within temple precincts, knowing that the sanctity of the space provided security. Temples engaged in trade themselves, sending emissaries along caravan routes and receiving goods from distant lands. This economic activity, combined with their control of land and labour, made temples among the most powerful institutions in Mesopotamia. Their wealth rivaled that of kings, and their influence extended into every sector of society. The integration of religion, economy, and politics through temples created a system of remarkable stability, but it was not without tension. Kings sometimes sought to curtail the independence of priests, asserting greater royal control over temple resources. Priests, for their part, defended their privileges and traditions, invoking divine authority to resist interference. These struggles reveal the delicate balance between throne and altar, a balance that shifted depending on the strength of the ruler and the loyalty of the priesthood. Despite occasional conflict, however, the partnership endured, for neither kingship nor priesthood could function without the other. Archaeological remains of temples illustrate their grandeur. Foundations of ziggurats, massive step towers, testify to the ambition of rulers and the devotion of worshippers. These structures, rising high above the plain, symbolize the link between heaven and earth. Climbing their steps was both a physical and spiritual ascent, bringing priests closer to the realm of the gods. The most famous of these, later known as the Tower of Baal, embodied the aspirations of Babylonian religion and the centrality of the temple in the life of the city. Its image would endure for centuries, transformed in later traditions into a symbol of human ambition, but in its own time it represented the unbreakable bond between Babylon and its gods. The daily cycle of rituals within the temples reinforced the rhythm of life. Morning offerings, midday ceremonies, and evening sacrifices structured time itself, aligning human activity with divine order. Hymns were recited, incense burned, and food placed before the statues of the gods. After rituals, the food was consumed by priests and temple personnel, a practice that symbolized the sharing of sustenance between gods and humans. This cycle continued day after day, year after year, ensuring continuity of worship and the constant renewal of divine presence within the city. As the old Babylonian period gave way to later centuries, the role of temples remained constant even as political fortune shifted. Conquerors and new dynasties might alter the balance of power, but they too invested in temples, knowing that legitimacy required divine sanction. Foreign rulers respected the traditions of Babylonian religion, and priests preserved their rituals through upheavals. The endurance of these institutions demonstrates their centrality. They were the backbone of Babylonian civilization, surviving the rise and fall of empires because they embodied more than politics. They embodied the conviction that the gods were present, that fate was decreed in divine assembly, and that order on earth was inseparable from ritual in the temple. The world of Babylon cannot be understood without recognizing the central place of temples and priests. They managed wealth, transmitted knowledge, interpreted divine will, and ensured the continuity of worship. They bound communities together through festivals and rituals, and they gave kings the legitimacy needed to rule. In their rituals and records, one sees how the Babylonian vision of the world was constructed, a universe where gods and humans coexisted in a relationship of dependence and service, sustained by offerings and sanctified by justice. This was the divine order that defined Babylon, shaping not only its religion but its economy, politics, and culture. From this foundation, Babylon would continue to grow, its gods rising in prominence, its temples expanding in grandeur, and its priests preserving traditions through centuries of change. The relationship between gods and city would only deepen, especially as Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, rose to supreme authority in the Mesopotamian pantheon. This evolution of divine hierarchy would transform Babylon's identity, turning it from one among many cities into the religious and cultural centre of the ancient Near East. The gods of Babylon were not only worshipped within temples and invoked in rituals, but also organised into a hierarchy that reflected the city's growing prestige. At the heart of this religious order stood Marduk, who rose from relative obscurity to become the supreme deity of Mesopotamia. His ascent was not sudden, but the result of centuries of political and theological development. As Babylon expanded in power, its patron god expanded with it, absorbing the functions, attributes, and authority of other deities, until he stood as the unrivalled ruler of the pantheon. The story of Marduk's rise is inseparable from the story of Babylon itself, for in the ancient world the fortunes of a city and the status of its gods were one and the same. In the earlier Sumerian traditions, Marduk did not occupy a central place. The great gods of the south were figures such as Enlil, who governed air and authority, Enki, associated with wisdom and the subterranean waters, and Anu, the Sky Father. Ishtar, Shamash, and Sin held sway over love and war, justice, and the moon. Marduk appears only faintly in early sources, tied to Babylon but not yet exalted above older and more established deities. His cult began locally, within Babylon's own precincts, and for a time his importance was confined to the city itself. Yet as Babylon grew into a political centre under the Amorite dynasty, it became necessary to elevate its god as well, for legitimacy required not only military might, but also divine endorsement on a cosmic scale. The process of Marduk's elevation is most clearly expressed in the great Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. This poem, recited during the New Year festival, tells of the struggle between order and chaos, embodied in the battle between the young gods and the primordial forces of Tiamat and Apsu. In the story, Marduk is chosen by the assembly of gods to lead them against Tiamat, the great serpent of the deep. Armed with his bow, net and winds, he defeats her in combat, splitting her body to form heaven and earth. From this act of creation, Marduk establishes the cosmic order, assigning roles to the other gods and fixing their places in the universe. The poem concludes with his enthronement as king of the gods, given 50 names that signify his supremacy and incorporate the powers of other deities. The Enuma Elish was not simply a myth, but a political and theological statement. By reciting it during the New Year festival, Babylon affirmed that its patron god was the supreme force in the cosmos, and by extension, that Babylon itself held divine mandate to rule. The absorption of the functions of other gods into Marduk's identity mirrored the way Babylon absorbed other cities into its empire. Just as Hammurabi consolidated Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule, so too did Marduk consolidate the divine order under his kingship. This blending of theology and politics ensured that Babylon's rise was not only material but spiritual, woven into the very structure of cosmic belief. Marduk's attributes were many. As a storm god, he commanded winds and floods, controlling the forces of nature that determined survival in Mesopotamia. As a lawgiver, he embodied justice, aligning his authority with that of Shamash, whose role as divine judge he absorbed. As creator, he fashioned humanity from the blood of a slain rebel god, giving people the task of serving the deities through labour and offerings. This act established the relationship between mortals and gods, defining humanity as dependent yet essential. In each of these roles, Marduk represented not only divine power, but the functions of governance, justice, and creation that Babylonian kings sought to emulate. The rise of Marduk did not eliminate the worship of other gods. The pantheon remained vast, with dozens of deities presiding over specific domains. Shamash continued to be honoured as the sun god, presiding over law and oaths. Ishtar remained central in her paradoxical nature as both bringer of fertility and goddess of war. Sin, the moon god, structured the calendar and cycles of time. Nabu, Marduk's son, became prominent as the god of writing and wisdom, his temple at Borsippa complementing the cult of Marduk in Babylon. These deities functioned within a hierarchy, but their cults were not destroyed by Marduk's supremacy. Instead, their authority was reframed, subordinated to his cosmic kingship, in the way that regional rulers acknowledged the supremacy of Babylon's monarch. This hierarchical ordering of the gods mirrored the structure of society and state. Just as kings relied on governors, generals and scribes, so too did Marduk rely on his divine council. The assembly of gods convened to decide matters of fate, and while Marduk presided, other deities played essential roles. In this way, the pantheon functioned as a reflection of human political order, making divine reality comprehensible to those who lived within Babylon's hierarchies. Rituals enacted this order, with priests invoking the gods in specific sequences that reinforce their relationships. The great festivals, particularly the Akitu, dramatize this structure, reminding the people of the cosmic order that sustained their world. The cult of Marduk was expressed most fully in the Esagila, his great temple complex in Babylon. This structure, whose name means House of the Raised Head, stood as the centre of his worship and the heart of the city's religious life. Within its precincts, the rituals of daily devotion, seasonal festivals and royal ceremonies affirmed Marduk's presence. Attached to the temple was the great ziggurat known as the Etemenanki, or House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. This massive step tower, rising high above the plain, symbolized the cosmic mountain linking heaven and earth, and later tradition would remember it as the Tower of Babel. The ziggurat embodied the theology of Marduk's supremacy, for it placed his temple at the very center of the universe. priests in the service of Marduk developed elaborate rituals that expressed his power. Daily offerings of food, drink, and incense sustained his statue, while hymns and prayers proclaimed his greatness. During festivals, his image was paraded through the city, accompanied by music and rejoicing crowds. Kings participated directly in these rituals, humbling themselves before the god to demonstrate their dependence on his favour. The dramatic moment of the Akitu festival saw the king stripped of his royal insignia and symbolically struck by the high priest, a ritual humiliation that emphasized that even the ruler was subject to Marduk. Only after reaffirming his humility did the king receive back his crown, symbolizing renewed legitimacy. Through these rituals, the supremacy of Marduk was made visible and enacted in the life of the city. The absorption of other deities' powers into Marduk was not only theological but also administrative. As Babylon became the political centre of Mesopotamia, its scribes and priests sought to unify diverse traditions under a single framework. Local gods of conquered cities were often identified with aspects of Marduk or placed within his divine household. In this way, the pantheon became a flexible system that could integrate new deities without threatening the supremacy of Babylon's god. This adaptability allowed Babylonian religion to absorb influences over centuries, even under foreign rule, while maintaining the centrality of Marduk. The relationship between Marduk and his son Nabu illustrates this process. Nabu, god of writing and wisdom, gained prominence in later periods, especially during the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. His temple at Borsippa became a major centre of worship, and during the New Year festival his statue was brought to Babylon to join that of his father. The association of Marduk with kingship and of Nabu with scribal knowledge reflected the dual foundations of Babylonian civilization, divine authority and human learning. Their combined worship reinforced the idea that cosmic order required both the power of the gods and the wisdom of humanity transmitted through writing and tradition. The theology of Marduk's supremacy had far-reaching consequences. By positioning him as the creator who ordered the cosmos, Babylonian thought provided a framework that influenced later cultures. Elements of the Enuma Elish and of Marduk's role as conqueror of chaos echo in subsequent traditions, where younger gods or heroes defeat primordial monsters to establish order. The notion of law and kingship deriving from divine mandate, already central in Hammurabi's time, gained additional weight through the figure of Marduk as cosmic ruler. His worship connected the political fate of Babylon to the structure of the universe itself, making the city not only a political capital, but a cosmic centre. The endurance of Marduk's cult demonstrates its success. Even when Babylon fell to foreign powers, conquerors respected his temple and participated in his rituals. Cyrus the Great of Persia, upon capturing Babylon, presented himself as chosen by Marduk, thereby securing legitimacy among the city's inhabitants. Later rulers, including Greeks and Parthians, maintained the temple traditions, recognizing that control of Babylon required acknowledgement of its god. The ability of Marduk's cult to transcend political change illustrates how deeply it was embedded in the identity of the city and the imagination of its people. The pantheon of Babylon, with Marduk at its head, was not static but evolving, adapting to political realities and theological needs. It provided a comprehensive vision of the universe, assigning roles to gods, structuring time and space, and integrating the city into cosmic order. Through myth, ritual, and temple life, this pantheon shaped the identity of Babylon, giving meaning to its history and resilience to its culture. The rise of Marduk to supremacy was not merely the story of a god, but the story of a civilization asserting its place in the world and in the cosmos. As Babylon continued to grow, the interplay between divine hierarchy and human society deepened. The gods were invoked not only in temples, but in contracts, treaties, and oaths, permeating every aspect of life. The pantheon was present in literature, guiding heroes and shaping destinies. It was present in law, ensuring justice and punishing wrongdoing. It was present in the stars as priests read the heavens for signs of divine will. From this religious foundation, Babylonian culture expanded into new realms of knowledge, producing achievements in literature, science, and astronomy that would influence civilizations far beyond Mesopotamia. The cultural life of Babylon found one of its greatest expressions in the written word, for within clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform signs, the people of Mesopotamia preserved their memory, their theology, their knowledge, and their stories. Among these texts, none has achieved greater fame than the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that, though rooted in Sumerian traditions older than Babylon itself, became central to Babylonian literature and identity. The story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk who sought immortality, was retold, reshaped, and transmitted across centuries, and by the Old Babylonian period it had become a literary masterpiece copied in schools and recited to audiences. Alongside it stood hymns, myths, proverbs, prayers, and legal texts, all forming a corpus that reveals how deeply the Babylonians valued the written word as both a tool of administration and a vessel of culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged from earlier Sumerian tales about a heroic king who performed great deeds. These shorter stories were eventually woven together into a longer narrative, first in the Old Babylonian version, and later in the Standard Babylonian version compiled during the first millennium BCE. In its developed form, the epic tells of Gilgamesh, part divine and part human, whose unmatched strength and ambition brought him both glory and suffering. At the beginning of the tale, his arrogance oppresses the people of Uruk, who appeal to the gods for relief. In response, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man who becomes Gilgamesh's rival, and then his closest companion. Together they embark on adventures, slaying the monstrous Humbaba in the cedar forest, and killing the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar. These victories, however, lead to tragedy when the gods decree that Enkidu must die. The death of Enkidu propels Gilgamesh into despair and a desperate quest to escape mortality. He journeys across the world, encountering Utnapishtim, a figure who survived a great flood and was granted eternal life by the gods. From him, Gilgamesh learns that immortality is not meant for mortals, that death is the destiny of humankind. Though he fails to achieve eternal life, he returns to Uruk with newfound wisdom, recognizing that his true legacy lies in the walls he built and the city he governed. The epic concludes with Gilgamesh pointing to the great ramparts of Uruk, a testament that human achievement endures even as individual lives pass. This story resonated deeply with Babylonian culture, for it articulated universal concerns about mortality, legacy, friendship, and the relationship between humans and the divine. It reflected the belief that kingship carried both power and responsibility, that human endeavours could achieve greatness, but never transcend the limits imposed by the gods. The themes of the epic were not abstract philosophy, but lessons embedded in narrative, accessible to audiences across social classes. Its preservation across centuries attests to its power, and its survival into the modern age has made it one of the earliest and most enduring works of world literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh was only one part of a vast literary tradition. Babylonian scribes produced hymns that praised the gods, exalting their power and recounting their deeds. Myths explained the origins of the world, the roles of deities, and the cycles of nature. Prayers and incantations sought divine favour or protection from illness and evil. Wisdom literature in the form of proverbs and dialogues explored questions of justice, fate, and human conduct. Many of these texts reveal a culture deeply engaged with the complexities of life, aware of its fragility, and committed to finding order through both divine guidance and human reflection. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, served not only as theology but as literature, with its dramatic battle between Marduk and Tiamat captivating audiences. Other myths, such as the descent of Ishtar into the underworld, explored themes of death and rebirth, reflecting agricultural cycles and human anxieties. These stories were copied in schools, performed in rituals, and transmitted orally, ensuring their place in cultural memory. Literature was not a separate sphere, but integrated into religion, education, and governance, shaping how Babylonians understood themselves and their world. The production and transmission of literature depended on the scribal schools, known as aduba, or tablet houses. In these institutions, young men underwent years of training, beginning with simple signs and progressing to complex texts. Students copied lists of words, proverbs, and model contracts before moving on to literary compositions. The curriculum preserved the great works of Mesopotamia, ensuring continuity across generations. Through this system, scribes not only learned technical skills but also absorbed cultural values, becoming the guardians of tradition. Their work gave Babylon a continuity of identity, even through periods of political upheaval. The physical form of Babylonian literature was the clay tablet, durable and abundant. Inscribed with a stylus, baked or dried in the sun, these tablets could survive for millennia, and thousands have been recovered by archaeologists. The sheer volume of texts testifies to the intensity of Babylonian literary culture. Archives from palaces, temples, and private households reveal collections of legal documents, letters, contracts, and literary works. In some cases, family libraries preserved texts across generations, showing how literature was valued not only by institutions but also by individuals. The rediscovery of these tablets in modern times has allowed scholars to reconstruct the intellectual world of Babylon with remarkable detail. Babylonian literature was not static but evolving. Texts were copied, adapted and expanded, reflecting the changing needs of society. The Old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh differs from later versions, showing how the story grew over time. Hymns were rephrased to honour new rulers, myths were adapted to reflect theological shifts, and incantations were updated to address contemporary fears. This adaptability ensured that literature remained relevant, connecting the present with the past while addressing current realities. In this way, Babylonian literature was both conservative and creative, preserving tradition while responding to change. The themes of Babylonian literature often return to the relationship between humans and the divine. The gods were seen as powerful, capricious, and essential, governing fate and demanding worship. Humanity, created to serve the gods, lived within limits, but also possessed dignity and purpose. Literature explored this tension, acknowledging the inevitability of suffering and death while celebrating human achievement and resilience. The Epic of Gilgamesh exemplifies this perspective, presenting a hero who cannot escape mortality, but who finds meaning in the legacy of his works and the bonds of friendship. This balance between resignation and aspiration defined much of Babylonian thought. Babylonian literature also reveals a fascination with knowledge. Texts of omens, astronomical observations, and medical incantations demonstrate the drive to understand and control the world. Lists of plants, animals, and stones reflect an attempt to catalogue nature. Mathematical tablets show complex calculations, including multiplication tables and geometric problems. These texts blur the line between science and literature, for in Babylonian culture, knowledge was sacred, often framed within a religious context. The pursuit of learning was itself a form of devotion, aligning human understanding with the order of the cosmos established by the gods. The endurance of Babylonian literature into later eras demonstrates its impact. The Epic of Gilgamesh was translated into other languages, influencing cultures beyond Mesopotamia. Fragments of Babylonian myths and proverbs appear in Hebrew, Greek, and other traditions, showing the wide reach of its ideas. In particular, the flood story recounted by Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic has striking parallels with later narratives in the Hebrew Bible, suggesting a shared cultural heritage in the ancient Near East. The transmission of these stories across boundaries illustrates how Babylonian literature formed part of a broader tapestry of human thought. The act of writing itself carried profound significance in Babylon. To inscribe a tablet was not merely to record, but to fix reality in durable form. Kings used inscriptions to proclaim their achievements, Priests used them to preserve rituals, and families used them to secure contracts. Literature, in this context, was both memory and authority, a means of preserving the past and guiding the future. The scribes who produced it occupied a privileged position, their skills granting them influence and respect. Through their labour, the culture of Babylon was etched into clay, leaving a legacy that could outlast empires. The presence of literature in everyday life extended beyond schools and temples. Letters written between family members reveal personal concerns, from disputes over property to expressions of affection. Proverbs circulated among the population, offering guidance and humour. Ritual texts provided formulas for protection, healing and success, accessible to those who sought divine help. In this way, literature permeated all levels of society, not only the elite, but also the ordinary people who turned to writing for practical and spiritual needs. As Babylon moved through centuries of change, literature remained a constant. Dynasties rose and fell, foreign rulers came and went, but the scribal tradition endured. Texts were recopied, libraries preserved, and myths retold. The survival of the Epic of Gilgamesh across millennia demonstrates this continuity, for it was recopied long after the Old Babylonian period, ensuring its transmission into the first millennium BCE and beyond. The resilience of Babylonian literature reflects the resilience of the city itself, which maintained its cultural identity through cycles of decline and renewal. The role of literature in Babylon was not limited to reflection, but also to instruction. Myths taught theological truths, epics conveyed moral lessons, proverbs offered guidance, and rituals prescribed conduct. Literature shaped values, reinforced hierarchies, and provided meaning. It was both entertainment and education, both sacred and secular, both practical and profound. In this integration, Babylonian literature reveals the depth of the civilization, its capacity to address the complexities of human existence through stories, laws, and hymns that remain compelling even today. From the walls of Uruk described by Gilgamesh to the cosmic battles of the Enuma Elish, from the prayers whispered in households to the records etched in temple archives, Babylonian literature encompassed the full spectrum of life. It preserved the voices of kings and commoners, of priests and poets, of scribes and merchants. It was the thread that bound together generations, transmitting not only words but identity. Through it, Babylon spoke to itself and to the world, proclaiming its place in history and in the cosmos. From this foundation of myth, epic and learning, Babylon would advance further into the realms of science and observation, turning its attention to the heavens and to numbers. Literature was never separate from knowledge, and the same scribes who copied the Epic of Gilgamesh also charted the stars and calculated the movements of planets. From the written word emerged not only stories, but systems of understanding that would shape astronomy, mathematics, and scholarship for centuries to come. The same scribes who copied myths and epics also turned their styluses to the recording of numbers, the charting of stars, and the cataloguing of the natural world. In Babylon, literature, science, and religion were inseparable, for the act of writing down knowledge was itself a sacred responsibility. The gods had given humanity the gift of writing through Nabu, the god of wisdom and scribes, and to preserve knowledge was to participate in the divine order. What modern scholarship describes as science was in Babylon a complex union of observation, divination, and calculation, all directed toward understanding and influencing the world. From the arrangement of stars in the night sky to the careful accounting of rations in temple archives, knowledge was systematized in ways that made Babylon one of the intellectual centers of the ancient world. Astronomy held a privileged place among the sciences, for the heavens were believed to reveal the will of the gods. Priests and scholars observed the rising and setting of stars, the movements of the moon, and the paths of planets across the sky. They recorded eclipses, conjunctions, and unusual celestial events on clay tablets, linking them to omens that could predict the fate of kings, the outcome of battles, or the prosperity of harvests. This practice, known as celestial divination, was based on the conviction that the heavens were a text written by the gods, readable by those trained in the art. Over centuries, these observations became increasingly precise, creating a body of data that laid the groundwork for later astronomical science. The Babylonians developed a sophisticated system for measuring time, rooted in the cycles of the moon. Months were counted according to lunar phases, and intercalary months were added when necessary to keep the calendar aligned with the seasons. Festivals and rituals depended on accurate reckoning of time, and priests ensured that the calendar reflected both divine order and agricultural needs. The moon god Sin was central to this system, his movements watched carefully from ziggurats and temple towers. In later centuries, Babylonian astronomers achieved remarkable accuracy in predicting lunar eclipses, demonstrating the cumulative effect of generations of systematic observation. Planets were also objects of careful study. Known as the wandering stars, they were associated with major gods: Jupiter with Marduk, Venus with Ishtar, Saturn with Ninurta, Mercury with Nabu, and Mars with Nergal. Their positions and movements were thought to signal divine intentions, and astronomical diaries record their appearances in detail. By the first millennium BCE, Babylonian astronomers could predict planetary phenomena with striking accuracy, using arithmetical methods that represent a significant advance in the history of science. These achievements were rooted in the long tradition of observation that began in the Old Babylonian period, showing how religious motivations could lead to scientific knowledge. Mathematics supported both astronomy and daily administration. The Babylonians inherited from the Sumerians a sexagesimal, or base 16 number system, which they developed to great sophistication. This system, still preserved today in our division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees, allowed for versatile calculations. Clay tablets from Babylon record multiplication tables, reciprocals, squares, and cubes, all used in practical and scholarly contexts. Problems involving areas of fields, volumes of storage containers, and calculations of rations reveal the everyday application of mathematics. More advanced tablets show quadratic equations, geometric problems, and astronomical calculations, evidence of a mathematical tradition that was both practical and theoretical. The training of scribes in mathematics was rigorous. Students copied long tables of numbers, solved word problems, and memorized formulas. Mathematics was not pursued as an abstract discipline, but as a tool for managing society. Surveyors measured fields to determine taxation, merchants calculated interest on loans, and priests used numbers to time rituals. Yet within these practical needs, a spirit of inquiry also thrived. The elegance of numerical patterns fascinated scribes, and their exploration of reciprocals and progressions shows a curiosity that transcended utility. In this balance between practical administration and intellectual pursuit, Babylonian mathematics achieved a distinctive character. Medicine was another field where knowledge blended with religion. Babylonian healers combined empirical observation with incantations and rituals. Clay tablets preserve diagnostic texts that list symptoms and possible outcomes, showing a systematic attempt to classify illnesses. Treatments included both herbal remedies and magical formulas, for disease was understood as both a physical and a spiritual phenomenon. Healers worked within a framework where the gods were believed to influence health, yet they also relied on accumulated practical knowledge of plants, surgery, and hygiene. This dual approach reflects the broader Babylonian worldview, in which no sharp line separated science from religion. The cataloguing of the natural world also occupied Babylonian scholars. Lexical lists compiled in scribal schools included extensive inventories of animals, plants, stones, and geographic terms. These lists served as tools for training in cuneiform, but also represent an early form of taxonomy. They reflect a desire to order knowledge, to classify the variety of existence, and to transmit it systematically. By organizing the world into categories, Babylonian scholars created a foundation for further inquiry, preserving information that would be used and adapted by later cultures. Libraries played a crucial role in preserving this knowledge. Collections of tablets were assembled in temples, palaces, and private houses, forming archives that spanned generations. The most famous of these, though later than the Old Babylonian period, was the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, which preserved many Babylonian texts. Yet smaller collections existed throughout Babylonia, ensuring that literature, law, science, and ritual were transmitted. The survival of these tablets into modern times owes much to the durability of clay and the diligence of scribes who recopied text repeatedly. The existence of these libraries demonstrates the centrality of knowledge in Babylonian society. Education ensured continuity. Young scribes not only learned to read and write, but also studied mathematics, astronomy, and medicine as part of their training. The curriculum integrated practical skills with cultural tradition, producing individuals capable of serving temples, palaces, and merchants. This system of education, sustained across centuries, created an intellectual elite whose influence extended far beyond Babylon. Their expertise was sought by kings, their records preserved the economy, and their observations shaped the understanding of the cosmos. The prestige of Babylon as a centre of learning attracted attention from neighbouring peoples, and its influence spread across the Near East. The impact of Babylonian science and knowledge extended well beyond its own time. Greek scholars later acknowledged their debt to Mesopotamian astronomy and mathematics, and elements of Babylonian methods entered Hellenistic and Islamic science. The division of the circle, the sexagesimal system, and the use of astronomical diaries all influenced later traditions. The continuity of knowledge across cultures demonstrates the significance of Babylonian achievements, for they represent not only a local intellectual tradition, but a contribution to the global history of science. The connection between knowledge and divination illustrates the unique character of Babylonian science. Observation was motivated by the desire to predict and control fate, and calculations were framed within religious contexts. Yet the results of these efforts transcended their original purposes. The precise recording of celestial phenomena, the systematic use of mathematics, and the careful classification of symptoms and signs all contributed to a body of knowledge that could be applied independently of its religious framework. In this way, Babylonian science reveals how the pursuit of practical and spiritual goals can lead to discoveries of lasting value. The prestige of scholars in Babylon reflected their role as mediators of knowledge. Known as Umanu, they served in temples and palaces, advising kings and interpreting omens. Their authority rested on mastery of texts, and their training required years of study. They were guardians of tradition, but also innovators, adapting old texts to new circumstances. Their work gave Babylon continuity, for through their efforts the wisdom of the past was never lost but constantly renewed. In their hands, the clay tablet was more than a tool. It was the vessel of civilization itself. The integration of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and divination into a single intellectual tradition demonstrates the unity of Babylonian culture. Knowledge was not fragmented into separate disciplines, but woven into a comprehensive worldview. The gods wrote their will in the stars, expressed it through illness, and structured it in numbers. To read these signs was to participate in the divine order. In this vision, science was not opposed to religion, but an extension of it, a way of aligning human understanding with cosmic truth. This unity explains both the achievements and the limitations of Babylonian science, for it was guided by theology, but capable of insights that transcended it. As Babylon moved forward through centuries of change, its role as a centre of knowledge endured. Conquerors who entered the city often preserved its scholars, recognizing their value. The traditions of astronomy and mathematics survived the fall of empires, transmitted through scribes who continued to copy and study texts. Even when Babylon itself declined, its intellectual legacy persisted, shaping the thought of later civilizations. The story of Babylon is therefore not only the story of kings and conquests, but also the story of knowledge preserved on clay, of stars charted in the night sky, and of numbers inscribed in base 60. From the pursuit of wisdom in temples and schools, Babylon advanced to achievements in art and architecture that gave physical form to its culture. Just as its scholars looked to the heavens, its builders raised ziggurats and palaces toward the sky, creating monuments that embodied both human ingenuity and divine devotion. The next step in Babylon's story lies not only in words and numbers, but in brick and stone, in the physical structures that still echo across history. The intellectual achievements of Babylon found their physical counterpart in the structures that defined its skyline. For while scribes inscribed tablets and priests read the stars, builders raised temples, ziggurats, and palaces that embodied the power of gods and kings alike. The architecture of Babylon was not only functional but symbolic, turning mud brick and stone into monuments that expressed cosmic order, royal authority, and civic pride. To walk through the streets of Babylon was to move within a carefully constructed landscape, where religion, politics, and society converged in physical form. The remnants of these structures, preserved in foundations, bricks, and texts, reveal how central architecture was to Babylonian life and identity. The foundation of Babylonian building was mud brick, the ubiquitous material of Mesopotamia. Stone was scarce in the alluvial plain, and timber was limited, but clay was abundant. Builders mixed mud with straw, moulded bricks, and baked them in the sun or in kilns. These bricks were used to construct houses, walls, and temples, their surfaces sometimes inscribed with the names of kings to commemorate building projects. Glazed bricks, developed in later periods, added colour and durability, transforming walls into surfaces of dazzling blue and gold. Through the mastery of this humble material, Babylonians created structures that could endure centuries and proclaim the power of their city to all who entered it. Temples stood at the heart of the city, both physically and spiritually. Each major deity had a sanctuary, and the most important of these was the Asagala, the temple of Marduk. This vast complex included courtyards, shrines, and storerooms, serving as both a place of worship and an administrative centre. Within its innermost chamber stood the cult statue of Marduk, tended daily by priests who performed rituals of washing, clothing, and feeding. The temple was designed to reflect the order of the cosmos, with its spatial arrangement symbolising the relationship between gods and humans. Its walls enclosed not only sacred space but also economic activity, for the temple managed lands, collected offerings, and distributed rations. The ziggurat attached to the Asagila was the most iconic structure of Babylon. Known as the Etemenanki, or House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, it rose in 7 terraces, each smaller than the one below, creating a stepped tower that reached toward the sky. At its summit stood a shrine dedicated to Marduk, believed to be a place where the god could descend to meet humanity. The ziggurats symbolised the cosmic mountain, the axis connecting heaven and earth, and its sheer height made it a visible marker of Babylon's supremacy. Later traditions would remember it as the Tower of Babel, a monument to human ambition, but in its own time it was a religious and political statement, proclaiming that Babylon stood at the centre of the universe. Construction of ziggurats required immense resources. Thousands of labourers moulded and carried bricks, while skilled craftsmen designed and supervised. Bitumen was used as mortar, providing strength and water resistance. Ramps and scaffolds allowed workers to raise materials to higher levels, a feat of engineering that demonstrated the organisational capacity of the state. Inscriptions on bricks and foundation deposits recorded the names of kings who sponsored construction, ensuring that their legacy was tied to the monument. These projects reinforced the bond between kingship and divinity, for by building temples and ziggurats, rulers displayed their piety and secured the favour of the gods. Palaces represented the other great form of Babylonian architecture. These were not merely residences, but administrative centres, courts of justice, and symbols of royal authority. Built on raised platforms and surrounded by thick walls, palaces contained reception halls, private apartments, storerooms, and workshops. Their walls were decorated with reliefs and painted designs, glorifying the king and proclaiming his role as protector of the people. Within their courtyards, officials and petitioners gathered, scribes recorded decrees, and ambassadors presented tribute. The palace was the locus of political life, as essential to the city's functioning as the temple was to its spiritual life. The relationship between temples and palaces was expressed in architecture. Both were monumental, both occupied central spaces, and both relied on similar materials and techniques. Yet their functions were distinct, reflecting the dual nature of Babylonian society. The temple embodied divine order, sustaining the gods through ritual and managing resources for the community. The palace embodied royal authority, administering law and coordinating the affairs of state. Together they created a balance of sacred and secular power, visible in the very fabric of the city. Walking from temple precincts to palace courtyards, a Babylonian inhabitant would move between two complementary centres of authority, each reinforcing the other. City walls formed another crucial element of Babylonian architecture. Massive fortifications surrounded the city, built of mud brick and strengthened with towers and gates. These walls were both practical defences and symbols of strength. Inscriptions describe kings boasting of their walls, declaring them impenetrable and eternal. The most famous of these was later the wall constructed under Nebuchadnezzar II, so broad that chariots could race along its top, according to tradition. Gates decorated with glazed bricks, such as the Ishtar Gate, displayed images of lions, dragons, and bulls, representing the gods and proclaiming Babylon's majesty to all who entered. Though the Ishtar Gate belongs to a later period, its roots lie in the long tradition of monumental gateways that combined defence with display. Domestic architecture was simpler but no less essential. Houses built of mud brick-lined narrow streets, often with 2 stories and central courtyards. Rooms opened onto these courtyards, providing light and ventilation. Roofs were flat, used for sleeping during hot nights and for household activities. The design reflected both practicality and cultural values, emphasizing privacy and family cohesion. In wealthier homes, walls were plastered and painted, and furnishings included wooden furniture, textiles, and pottery. Though less durable than temples or palaces, these houses formed the fabric of daily life, connecting the monumental architecture of the city with the experiences of its inhabitants. Public works such as canals, bridges, and roads also demonstrated Babylonian architectural skill. Canals required constant maintenance, their banks reinforced with baked brick to prevent erosion. Bridges of wood and brick spanned waterways, facilitating trade and communication. Roads paved with clay and gravel connected districts within the city and linked Babylon to its hinterland. These works, though less grand than ziggurats or palaces, were vital to the functioning of the city, reflecting the administrative efficiency that supported Babylonian civilization. Archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, allows reconstruction of Babylon's urban layout. The city was organized into districts, with temples, palaces, and markets occupying central spaces. Streets radiated outward, lined with houses and workshops. Canals intersected the city, providing water and transport. Gardens and orchards added greenery within the walls, while fields spread beyond. This integration of monumental, residential, and agricultural spaces reflects the complexity of Babylonian urbanism, where religion, politics, economy, and daily life were intertwined. The symbolism of architecture was as important as its function. Temples and ziggurats represented the presence of the gods, Palaces represented the authority of the king, and walls represented the strength of the community. Each building carried meanings that reinforced the cultural order. To build was to assert identity, to proclaim continuity, and to ensure memory. Kings invested heavily in construction not only for practical needs, but to inscribe their names into history. Bricks stamped with royal inscriptions remind us that architecture was as much about legacy as utility. The endurance of Babylonian architectural traditions is evident in their influence on later cultures. Ziggurats inspired monumental towers and stepped platforms elsewhere, while the use of glazed bricks influenced Persian and later Islamic architecture. The concept of monumental gateways, combining defence and display, resonated across the Near East. Even in biblical and classical traditions, Babylon's architecture remained legendary, remembered as both wondrous and intimidating. The image of the Tower of Babel, though transformed in later retellings, reflects the enduring impact of Babylonian monumentalism on human imagination. For the Babylonians themselves, architecture was a way of participating in divine creation. Just as Marduk had ordered the cosmos by dividing chaos into heaven and earth, so too did kings and builders order the city by constructing temples, palaces, and walls. Each brick laid was an act of piety, each foundation deposit a prayer for stability, each completed building a reflection of cosmic order. The physical city mirrored the metaphysical universe, and to maintain its structures was to maintain harmony with the gods. In this way, architecture was not only engineering but theology, not only construction but devotion. As Babylon moved forward in history, its monuments would be rebuilt, expanded, and reinterpreted. Later dynasties, from Kassites to Neo-Babylonians, invested heavily in construction, leaving their own marks on the city. Yet the foundations laid in the Old Babylonian period established the principles: the centrality of temples, the prominence of ziggurats, the authority of palaces, and the strength of walls. These principles defined Babylonian architecture for centuries, ensuring continuity even as styles evolved. The city's identity was inscribed in brick and mortar as firmly as in clay tablets, from the grandeur of its temples and ziggurats to the simplicity of its houses and canals. Babylon's architecture revealed its character as a civilization that united the sacred and the practical. Its builders transformed clay into monuments of faith and power, shaping a landscape where gods and humans coexisted. To stand within Babylon was to be surrounded by reminders of divine presence and royal authority, a constant affirmation of order in a world where chaos was always near. The city that grew around these monuments would endure challenges from foreign powers, adapting and surviving through centuries of change. Yet its architectural heritage remained a constant, a visible testament to its resilience and creativity. From these physical structures, Babylon entered the imagination of the later ages as a city of splendour, remembered for its towers, walls, and palaces. And as Babylon's dynasties shifted, new rulers would continue to build, each adding to the legacy of architecture that defined the city as both a political capital and a cosmic centre. The decline of Hammurabi's dynasty and the weakening of Babylonian control in the centuries after his reign opened the city to a long period of transition, one that would be marked not by disappearance, but by transformation under new rulers. The Kassites, a people who had originally dwelled in the Zagros Mountains to the east of Mesopotamia, gradually came to dominate Babylon, ruling the land for nearly 4 centuries. This period, often overlooked because it lacked the dramatic conquests of earlier and later eras, was in fact one of the longest and most stable phases in Babylon's history. The Kassite dynasty brought continuity to institutions, preserved traditions, and integrated themselves into Mesopotamian culture, while also introducing new elements that reshaped Babylon's identity. It was an interlude, but one that ensured the survival and renewal of Babylonian civilization. The Kassites did not emerge suddenly as rulers of Babylon. For centuries they had been known on the fringes of Mesopotamia, sometimes appearing as mercenaries in the armies of more established powers, sometimes raiding lowland territories. Their name appears in texts from the Old Babylonian and Middle Babylonian periods, and it seems that they maintained a presence in the region long before assuming control. Their rise was facilitated by the decline of Babylon, after Hammurabi's successors failed to maintain the empire. Foreign invasions, internal weakness, and the growing strength of rivals left the city vulnerable. The Hittite king Steelely the Army struck Babylon in the mid-16th century BCE, sacking it and carrying off treasures, including the famous stele of Hammurabi's laws. In the aftermath of this blow, the Kassites stepped into the power vacuum, establishing themselves as rulers of Babylon. Once in power, the Kassites demonstrated remarkable pragmatism. Rather than imposing their own language and customs, they adopted Akkadian, the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, for administration and inscriptions. They embraced Babylonian religion, honouring Marduk as the chief god and rebuilding temples to secure divine favour. They preserved the scribal schools, ensuring the continuity of cuneiform writing and literary traditions. In doing so, they legitimized themselves in the eyes of the Babylonian population, presenting their rule not as foreign domination but as rightful kingship sanctioned by the gods. Their ability to integrate into Babylonian culture was key to their longevity, for they became more Babylonian than foreign, blending their heritage into the fabric of Mesopotamian civilization. At the same time, the Kassites introduced new elements that left lasting marks. They brought with them names and deities of Kassite origin, some of which entered the Babylonian pantheon. They introduced the kuduru, or boundary stone, a distinctive form of monument that recorded royal grants of land and privileges. These kuduru, carved with inscriptions and symbolic images, served as legal documents and expressions of royal authority. They often depicted gods in symbolic form, such as weapons, animals, or celestial symbols, arrayed to witness the grant. The kuduru demonstrate both continuity with Babylonian traditions of land ownership and innovation in the use of symbolic art and legal display. The Kassite period was characterized less by conquest abroad than by stability at home. Unlike Hammurabi's dynasty, which had sought to dominate Mesopotamia through military campaigns, the Kassite rulers emphasized consolidation and endurance. They maintained Babylon as a major city, preserved its temples, and invested in agriculture and infrastructure. This stability allowed Babylonian culture to flourish. The scribes continued to copy and compose texts, priests maintained rituals, and artisans produced goods for both local use and long-distance trade. The Kassite dynasty thus served as custodians of Babylonian civilization during a time when other powers rose and fell around them. Diplomacy became a hallmark of Kassite rule. The Kassite kings corresponded with other great rulers of the Late Bronze Age, including the pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of the Hittites, and the rulers of Assyria and Mitanni. Letters from this period, preserved in the Amarna archive in Egypt, reveal Babylonian kings addressing foreign rulers as brothers, a term reserved for equals. These letters discuss the exchange of gifts, the arrangement of marriages, and the negotiation of alliances. Babylonian kings sent horses, lapis lazuli, and textiles, while receiving gold, ivory, and other luxuries from abroad. This diplomatic network placed Babylon firmly within the international system of the Late Bronze Age, enhancing its prestige without requiring extensive military campaigns. Economically, the Kassite period saw continuity and adaptation. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, with irrigation canals, fields of barley, and groves of date palm sustaining the population. The Kassitic kings granted lands to loyal officials, soldiers, and temples, often recorded on kuduru. These grants helped create a network of dependents tied to the dynasty, reinforcing loyalty while distributing resources. Trade connected Babylon to distant regions, with caravans and river transport carrying goods across Mesopotamia and beyond. The stability of Kassite rule encouraged such economic activity, fostering prosperity that supported cultural continuity. Religion during the Kassite period remained firmly Babylonian, with Marduk continuing as the supreme deity. Temples were rebuilt and expanded, and rituals continued without interruption. At the same time, Kassite deities such as Shukamuna and Shumaliya were introduced, reflecting the blending of traditions. These gods were associated with kingship and received offerings alongside Babylonian deities, symbolizing the integration of Kassite identity into Babylonian religion. The continuity of worship ensured that the legitimacy of the dynasty was reinforced by divine sanction, while the introduction of new elements reflected the adaptability of Babylonian religion to changing circumstances. Art and architecture under the Kassites continued Mesopotamian traditions while introducing distinct styles. Kuduru, with their symbolic representations of gods, represent a unique contribution of the Kassite era. Palaces and temples were constructed or renovated, though few have survived intact. Cylinder seals from this period display intricate designs, often depicting deities, animals, and mythological scenes. These artifacts demonstrate the fusion of Kassite and Babylonian artistic traditions, producing a style that was recognizable yet distinct. The blending of motifs mirrored the blending of cultures, showing how the Kassites became part of the Mesopotamian world while retaining traces of their heritage. The Kassite period was not entirely free of challenges. Assyria grew stronger in the north, eventually becoming a formidable rival. Elam to the east remained a threat, occasionally raiding Babylonian territories. Internal pressures also emerged, as the distribution of land and privileges created inequalities and tensions. Yet the Kassite dynasty endured, adjusting to shifting circumstances and maintaining control for centuries. Their resilience demonstrates the effectiveness of their policies of integration and continuity, for they managed to hold Babylon together during a time when other dynasties collapsed. One of the most significant aspects of the Kassite era was its role in preserving Babylonian culture during the Late Bronze Age collapse. While many societies across the eastern Mediterranean experienced destruction and decline around the 12th century BCE, Babylon endured. The Kassite dynasty eventually fell to outside pressures, with Elamite invasions contributing to its downfall. But by then, Babylonian culture had survived centuries of change and was prepared to continue under new rulers. The Kassites had ensured that the traditions of cuneiform writing, Babylonian religion, and Mesopotamian administration remained intact, ready to be carried forward. The long Kassite rule left Babylon with a legacy of continuity and adaptation. They maintained the identity of the city, preserved its institutions, and integrated themselves into its traditions. Their innovations, such as the Kuduru, added new dimensions to Babylonian culture, while their diplomacy connected the city to the international world. Though less celebrated than Hammurabi or Nebuchadnezzar, the Kassite kings played a vital role in ensuring that Babylon remained a central power in Mesopotamia. Without their stability, the later resurgence of Babylon might not have been possible. From the vantage point of history, the Kassite interlude appears as a bridge between eras. It connected the grandeur of the old Babylonian kingdom with the future rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, maintaining continuity while allowing transformation. In their ability to adapt, to integrate, and to endure, the Kassites demonstrated a form of rulership that valued stability over expansion, preservation over conquest. Their rule ensured that Babylon did not vanish in the turbulence of the Late Bronze Age, but instead remained a city whose traditions could be renewed in the centuries to come. As the Kassite dynasty came to its end, Babylon would face new challenges from rising Assyria, from Elam, and from the shifting dynamics of Mesopotamia. The decline of Kassite power opened the door to centuries of competition and conflict, during which Babylon's identity would be tested but not erased. The city would survive, its gods still worshipped, its scribes still copying texts, its walls still standing. The Kassite interlude had preserved the heart of Babylonian civilization, allowing it to continue its journey through the storms of history. The fall of the Kassite dynasty did not bring an end to Babylonian life. but it did usher in a long and complex relationship with new imperial neighbours, above all Assyria. For centuries, Babylon and Assyria shared a cultural foundation, both speaking Akkadian in its different dialects, both writing in cuneiform, both worshipping many of the same gods, both inheriting the traditions of Mesopotamia. Yet the balance of power between them was uneven. While Babylon retained immense prestige as the city of Marduk and the cradle of revered traditions, Assyria in the north grew into a military powerhouse whose armies swept across the Near East. In this world of empires, Babylon often found itself overshadowed, pulled between the assertion of its own identity and the realities of living beside a stronger neighbour. The end of Kassite power had left Babylon politically weakened, vulnerable to external pressure and internal fragmentation. Assyria, by contrast, was rising. From its heartland along the Tigris River, Assyria had developed a system of kingship and administration that emphasized military expansion and discipline. Assyrian kings commanded standing armies equipped with iron weapons, siege engines and chariots, making them formidable opponents. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, Assyria had become a regional power capable of challenging any rival, and Babylon lay directly in its path. The proximity of the two states made conflict inevitable, but it also fostered cultural exchange and political entanglement. The relationship between Babylon and Assyria was never simple. At times, Babylonian kings and Assyrian kings were allies, bound by marriage and diplomacy. At other times, they were bitter enemies, waging wars that devastated the land. Assyrian kings coveted Babylon for its wealth, its symbolic value, and its religious prestige, while Babylonian rulers sought to preserve independence by playing Assyria against Elam, the Arameans, and other powers. This shifting balance produced centuries of tension, cooperation, betrayal, and conquest, each episode leaving its mark on the city. One of the most important dimensions of this relationship was religious. Babylon held unique prestige because it was the city of Marduk, whose supremacy in the pantheon had been established through the Enuma Elish and the rituals of the Akitu festival. Even the mighty Assyrian kings, when they occupied Babylon, found it politically necessary to honour Marduk and participate in Babylonian ceremonies. To neglect the rituals of Marduk was to risk losing legitimacy in the eyes of both Babylonians and the wider Mesopotamian world. Thus, Assyrian rulers who conquered Babylon often styled themselves as protectors of the city and its gods, even as their armies destroyed its walls. This paradox reveals the power of Babylon's cultural and religious prestige, which endured even when its political power was fragile. Economically, Babylon remained vital despite its political troubles. Its fertile lands produced abundant crops, its merchants traded across Mesopotamia, and its artisans created goods valued abroad. Assyrian rulers were well aware of this wealth and sought to control it. Conquest of Babylon meant access to resources, but it also meant access to the symbolic authority that Babylon carried. This was why Assyrian kings often claimed titles that associated them with Babylonian tradition, presenting themselves not only as conquerors, but as legitimate heirs of Mesopotamian kingship. The tension between domination and assimilation defined the Assyro-Babylonian relationship. The conflict between Babylon and Assyria was not constant but cyclical. There were periods of peace, sometimes lasting decades, during which Babylonian culture flourished, and Assyrian kings respected Babylonian autonomy. Treaties and dynastic marriages reinforced these arrangements, yet tensions always returned, often sparked by disputes over borders, succession crises, or shifting alliances with Elam. The result was a series of wars that could devastate Babylon, with cities burned, temples plundered, and populations displaced. Inscriptions from Assyrian kings often boast of campaigns against Babylon, yet they also reveal the difficulty of controlling it. Babylon's resilience, rooted in its cultural prestige, ensured that it always re-emerged even after defeat. The Assyrian kings who dealt with Babylon reveal the complexity of this relationship. Tukulti-Ninurta Thorn in the 13th century BCE, conquered Babylon and even carried off the statue of Marduk to Assyria, an act of sacrilege in the eyes of Babylonians. This seizure of the god's image symbolized both conquest and humiliation, but it also placed the Assyrians in a difficult position, for possession of Marduk's statue implied responsibility for his cult. Later, the statue was returned, and the incident became a reminder of the dangers of offending Babylon's religious traditions. Other kings, such as Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II in the first millennium BCE, alternated between aggression and conciliation, sometimes installing themselves as kings of Babylon, sometimes appointing local rulers, sometimes devastating the city in anger. For Babylonians, survival in this world of empires required adaptability. Local elites negotiated with Assyrian rulers, balancing collaboration with resistance. Priests preserved rituals, ensuring that the cult of Marduk continued even under foreign domination. Scribes continued their work, copying texts and maintaining libraries, sustaining the cultural identity of Babylon regardless of political circumstances. Ordinary people adjusted to shifting rulers while maintaining the rhythms of agriculture, trade and family life. The resilience of Babylonian society ensured that the city endured despite repeated conquests. The broader context of the late Bronze and early Iron Ages shaped this dynamic. The collapse of older powers, the migrations of new peoples such as the Arameans, and the rise of Assyria all created an environment of instability. Babylon's strategic location in southern Mesopotamia made it both vulnerable and indispensable. Its land was fertile, its position central, its culture prestigious. These qualities ensured that no empire could ignore it, but they also meant that Babylon was rarely free from entanglement in wider struggles. The shadow of Assyria loomed over every Babylonian dynasty, a constant reminder of the challenges of survival in a world of empires. Despite these pressures, Babylon never lost its identity. Its temples continued to function, its festivals continued to draw crowds, and its literature continued to be copied. Even Assyrian kings who destroyed parts of the city rebuilt them later, recognizing that Babylon's prestige was too valuable to leave in ruins. The cyclical pattern of destruction and restoration became a feature of Babylon's history, reflecting both its vulnerability and its resilience. In the long run, Babylon's endurance would outlast even the Assyrian Empire itself, for while Assyria eventually collapsed under the weight of external and internal pressures, Babylon would rise again as the center of a new empire. The experience of living in the shadow of Assyria shaped Babylon's identity in profound ways. It forced the city to adapt politically, to negotiate diplomatically, and to preserve its traditions under foreign rule. It reinforced the centrality of religion, for the cult of Marduk became a rallying point for identity even when kingship was contested. It deepened the prestige of Babylonian culture, for its survival through centuries of Assyrian pressure testified to its strength, and it set the stage for the dramatic resurgence of Babylon in the late 7th and 6th centuries BCE, when it would once again claim dominance over Mesopotamia. The story of Babylon in a world of empires is therefore not only one of subjugation, but also one of survival. It illustrates how a city can endure even when politically overshadowed, how culture and religion can preserve identity through cycles of conquest and restoration. The shadow of Assyria was long and often dark, but Babylon's light never went out. It flickered, it dimmed, it was sometimes obscured, but it endured, sustained by the resilience of its people and the prestige of its gods. As Assyria rose to its greatest heights, conquering lands from Egypt to the mountains of Iran, Babylon remained at the center of its concerns. No Assyrian empire was complete without Babylon, and no Assyrian king could claim supremacy without addressing the city's traditions. This paradox ensured that Babylon, even in weakness, retained influence. Its very existence as the city of Marduk forced empires to acknowledge it, to engage with its culture, and to participate in its rituals. In this way, Babylon shaped the very empires that sought to dominate it, leaving a mark on Assyria even as Assyria left its mark on Babylon. The decline of Assyria in the late 7th century BCE opened new possibilities for Babylon. As Assyrian power faltered under the strain of rebellion, invasion and overextension, Babylon seized the opportunity to reassert itself. Led by Nabopolassar, Babylon allied with the Medes to bring down Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, in 612 BCE. The fall of Assyria transformed the balance of power in Mesopotamia, ending centuries of Assyrian dominance and allowing Babylon to step out of the shadows into the light of empire once more. The long experience of living under Assyrian pressure had prepared Babylon for this moment, equipping it with resilience, traditions and identity strong enough to carry it into a new age of greatness. The centuries spent in the shadow of Assyria had been long and difficult, but they also prepared Babylon for the moment when the balance of power shifted. By the late 7th century BCE, Assyria, once the terror of the Near East and the unrivaled master of empire, was weakened. The weight of its conquests, the constant rebellions in subject lands, the strain of maintaining vast armies, and the ambitions of rival powers combined to create an opening. Babylon, long constrained, long humbled, and long dependent on the will of Assyrian kings, was ready to seize its chance. Out of this crucible emerged Nabopolassar, the man who would lead Babylon from subjugation to supremacy, founding the Neo-Babylonian dynasty and overseeing the final collapse of Assyria. The decline of Assyria had many causes. Its kings had ruled with ferocity, deporting populations, razing rebellious cities, and exacting tribute from distant lands. This system brought immense wealth but also sowed resentment and instability. Revolts broke out in Egypt, Elam, and across the Levant. Nomadic groups pressed at the borders, while internal struggles weakened the unity of the royal court. By the middle of the 7th century, the Assyrian Empire had reached its territorial zenith, but also its breaking point. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, presided over both glory and fragility, amassing a famous library at Nineveh, but leaving behind a fractured state at his death. His successors faced revolts they could not quell, and enemies they could not contain. In this atmosphere, Babylon's own traditions and grievances came to the fore. The city had suffered humiliations at Assyrian hands, its temples desecrated, its people subjected, its autonomy curtailed. Yet Babylon had always retained its prestige as the city of Marduk, and the longing for independence never disappeared. When Assyrian authority faltered, Babylonians rallied behind a leader who could articulate their aspirations and challenge the might of their northern overlords. Nabopolassar, originally a local official of Chaldean descent from southern Mesopotamia, proved to be that figure. His origins outside the traditional Babylonian elite gave him ties to powerful tribal groups, while his political acumen allowed him to harness Babylon's urban traditions. In 626 BCE, he declared himself king, initiating open revolt against Assyria. The struggle that followed was not quick but grueling. Nabopolassar had to consolidate his position within Babylonia, ensuring the loyalty of cities and temples, while also facing Assyrian attempts to crush the rebellion. His legitimacy rested on both political success and religious sanction. By aligning himself with Marduk and restoring Babylon's temples, he presented himself as the chosen defender of the gods. The priests of Babylon, long resentful of Assyrian interference, lent him their support, giving the rebellion a sacred dimension. Nabopolassar was not only a warlord but also a restorer, presenting his cause as the renewal of Babylonian tradition. Assyria, though weakened, remained formidable. Its armies marched south to confront Nabopolassar, and battles were fought across Mesopotamia. The struggle seesawed, with neither side gaining decisive advantage at first. Nabopolassar relied on guerrilla tactics, alliances with southern tribes, and the resilience of Babylon's fortifications. He endured sieges and counterattacks, gradually wearing down Assyrian strength. Yet it became clear that Babylon alone could not destroy Assyria. to succeed, Nabopolassar needed allies who shared his interest in breaking the Northern Empire's dominance. That ally appeared in the form of the Medes, an Iranian people rising to power in the highlands to the east. Under King Cyaxares, the Medes sought to expand westward and to challenge Assyria's supremacy. Babylon and Media formed an alliance, sealed by shared interest in Assyria's destruction and strengthened by marriage ties. This coalition proved decisive, for together they could field armies large and determined enough to strike at the heart of the Assyrian state. The partnership of Babylonians and Medes would change the course of Near Eastern history. The campaigns that followed were brutal. In 614 BCE, the Medes captured the Assyrian city of Assur, one of Assyria's ancient capitals, striking at the very heart of the empire. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, the combined forces of Babylon and Media laid siege to Nineveh, the great capital built by the kings of Assyria as a symbol of their might. The siege lasted for months, with battering rams, sappers, and relentless assaults. Eventually the walls were breached, and Nineveh fell. Contemporary sources describe fire and destruction on a scale that shocked even hardened observers. The city was looted, its palaces destroyed, its monuments toppled. The library of Ashurbanipal, with its thousands of tablets, was buried in rubble, preserved for future generations but lost to its creators. The fall of Nineveh marked the effective end of Assyria as a great power. The final campaigns mopped up remnants of Assyrian resistance. The surviving forces fled west and sought aid from Egypt. Battles were fought along the Euphrates, with Babylonian and Median armies pursuing their enemies. By 609 BCE, the last Assyrian stronghold at Haran was captured, and the empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries was gone. The world had changed, and Babylon had stepped from the shadows into the forefront. Nabopolassar was hailed as the founder of a new dynasty, the saviour of Babylon and the destroyer of Assyria. The consequences of Assyria's fall were immense. The political map of the Near East was redrawn, with Babylon and Media emerging as the dominant powers. Egypt sought to fill the vacuum, extending its influence into the Levant, but it would soon clash with the new Babylonian Empire. For Babylonians, the victory was both material and symbolic. The city that had endured centuries of subjugation now stood as the heir of Mesopotamian tradition, wielding the authority of Marduk and the legacy of Hammurabi. Nabopolassar's reign represented the fulfillment of long-held aspirations, and his dynasty would bring Babylon to heights of splendour not seen since its earliest kings. The rise of Neo-Babylon under Nabopolassar was not only a military and political achievement, but also a cultural renewal. The restoration of temples, the reaffirmation of festivals, and the investment in Babylon's urban landscape all signalled a rebirth. The city itself became the centre of a vast empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, commanding resources and populations that enriched its life. Nabopolassar's victory created the foundation upon which his son Nebuchadnezzar II would build, transforming Babylon into a metropolis of monumental architecture and global renown. Yet Nabopolassar's achievement must be understood in context. He did not erase the memory of Assyria, nor could he undo the centuries of influence it had exerted. Instead, he absorbed aspects of Assyrian administration, adopting practices of imperial governance while asserting Babylonian identity. The empire he founded was both a continuation and a transformation of Mesopotamian traditions. It preserved the resilience forged in the Assyrian shadow while projecting a new vision of Babylonian supremacy. In this sense, the Neo-Babylonian dynasty was the culmination of centuries of struggle, adaptation, and endurance. Nabopolassar himself ruled until 605 BCE, securing Babylon's position and passing the throne to his son. His reign was remembered not only for the destruction of Assyria, but for the re-establishment of Babylon as a central power. He exemplified the fusion of local leadership, religious legitimacy, and international alliance that enabled Babylon to rise, his achievement was not inevitable. It was the product of careful diplomacy, relentless determination, and the ability to seize opportunity when empires faltered. The fall of Assyria was as much Babylon's triumph as it was Assyria's tragedy, for it signalled the end of one order and the birth of another. The rise of Neo-Babylon under Nabopolassar marks a turning point in the history of Mesopotamia. The city that had so often been dominated was now the dominator. The traditions preserved through Kassite endurance and Assyrian shadows now flourished under new rulers who could express them with confidence. Babylon was once again a capital worthy of its gods, a city that could claim to embody the order of the cosmos. The stage was set for an era of glory under Nebuchadnezzar II, when Babylon would become not only a political power, but a marvel of the ancient world, remembered for its walls, its palaces, and its legendary gardens. When Nabopolassar secured Babylon's independence and oversaw the fall of Assyria, he laid a foundation that his son would elevate into one of the most powerful and splendid empires of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE, is remembered as the most prominent ruler of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, a king whose name has echoed through history in inscriptions, biblical texts, and classical accounts. His reign marked the zenith of Babylon's power, when the city stood not merely as a Mesopotamian capital but as a world metropolis, the hub of empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant and beyond. Nebuchadnezzar combined military conquest, architectural ambition, economic organisation, and cultural patronage, leaving behind a legacy that ensured Babylon's place in the imagination of later ages. Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne already seasoned in war. As crown prince, he had commanded Babylonian armies against Egyptian forces, most famously at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE. This decisive clash, fought near the Euphrates, saw Babylonian and allied Median troops defeat the Egyptians and their remaining Assyrian allies, effectively ending Egyptian hopes of dominating Syria and Mesopotamia. With this victory, Babylon inherited the mantle of Near Eastern supremacy, securing control over lands that had once formed the western provinces of Assyria. Soon after, Nabopolassar's death placed Nebuchadnezzar on the throne, giving him both the authority of kingship and the prestige of a victorious general. From the outset, Nebuchadnezzar pursued an assertive foreign policy. His reign was marked by repeated campaigns to secure Babylon's frontiers, particularly in the Levant, where Egypt continued to exert influence, and local states resisted Babylonian control. Cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Jerusalem found themselves caught between great powers, and Nebuchadnezzar's armies marched westward year after year to impose order. The biblical account of his campaigns in Judah, including the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE and the exile of its elite population to Babylon, reflects the impact of his policies on local communities. Archaeological and inscriptional evidence confirms that Nebuchadnezzar's presence was felt across the Levant, where fortresses were garrisoned, cities besieged, and tribute extracted. These conquests were not pursued for glory alone, but to secure the resources and stability of the empire. Control over trade routes, agricultural lands, and strategic strongholds ensured the flow of wealth into Babylon. Tribute from subject states, booty from campaigns, and taxes from conquered lands enriched the treasury. This wealth, in turn, funded Nebuchadnezzar's ambitious building projects and sustained the elaborate rituals of Babylon's temples. Military expansion and domestic prosperity were inseparable, each reinforcing the other in a cycle that elevated Babylon to its height. Nebuchadnezzar's reign is most celebrated for his architectural endeavours. The city of Babylon, already ancient, was transformed into a metropolis of unprecedented scale and grandeur. Massive walls encircled the city, constructed with baked bricks and bitumen, and so wide that chariots could ride upon them according to later accounts. Gates decorated with glazed bricks provided both defence and spectacle, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate. adorned with images of lions, bulls and dragons symbolizing the gods. This gate formed the entrance to the processional way, a broad avenue lined with glazed brick reliefs that led into the heart of the city. During festivals, statues of the gods were carried along this route, surrounded by crowds who witnessed the power of Babylon made manifest in stone and colour. The temples of Babylon received lavish attention. The Esagila, dedicated to Marduk, was rebuilt and expanded, its courtyards filled with offerings, its sanctuaries gleaming with precious materials. Attached to it rose the great ziggurat, Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, towering in stepped terraces toward the sky. Later traditions associated this monument with the Tower of Babel, and though the biblical story recast it as a symbol of human pride, in Babylonian eyes it was a statement of devotion and cosmic order. By raising the ziggurat, Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed that Babylon was the axis of the universe, the point where heaven and earth met under the authority of Marduk and his chosen king. Palaces also rose under Nebuchadnezzar's direction. His southern palace near the Euphrates contained grand halls, administrative offices and royal apartments, decorated with glazed bricks and inscriptions. Courtyards and gardens provided space for leisure and ceremony, while storerooms held the wealth of empire. These palaces were not only residences but centres of government, where officials managed the affairs of the realm and foreign envoys were received. The scale of these complexes reflected the scale of Babylonian power, making clear that the king who ruled within them commanded an empire of vast extent. Among the wonders attributed to Nebuchadnezzar's reign is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, later counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Classical authors describe a series of terraced gardens rising like a green mountain within the city, watered by ingenious machinery that lifted water from the Euphrates. According to legend, Nebuchadnezzar built them for his queen, who longed for the hills of her homeland. Modern scholars debate the existence and location of the gardens, with some suggesting they may have been in Nineveh rather than Babylon. But the association with Nebuchadnezzar reflects his reputation as a builder, whose ambition extended beyond necessity into marvel. Whether myth or reality, the idea of the Hanging Gardens embodies the perception of Babylon as a city of wonder, its walls enclosing not only temples and palaces, but gardens that defied nature. Nebuchadnezzar's economic policy sustained these monumental works. Agriculture was carefully managed, with canals repaired and expanded to irrigate fields of barley and date groves. Taxation ensured a steady flow of resources from subject lands, while trade brought luxury goods from distant regions. Merchants from across the Near East passed through Babylon, exchanging silver, textiles, and grain for timber, stone, and metals not available in Mesopotamia. The wealth concentrated in Babylon supported not only construction, but also the elaborate rituals of its temples, which required constant offerings and sacrifices. Priests, scribes, and artisans all depended on this system, making Nebuchadnezzar's administration central to the functioning of society. Religion remained at the core of Nebuchadnezzar's kingship. He portrayed himself as chosen by Marduk, the protector of Babylon, and his inscriptions emphasize his role as builder and restorer of temples. The annual Akitu festival, during which the king humbled himself before the god and renewed his legitimacy, remained a central event of the calendar. Nebuchadnezzar's patronage ensured that rituals continued with grandeur, reinforcing the bond between divine and human authority. His building projects were dedicated not only to practical needs, but to the gods themselves, making architecture a form of worship. The cultural life of Babylon flourished under his rule. Scribble schools copied and preserved literature, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to hymns and incantations. Astronomers observed the skies, continuing the traditions of celestial divination while advancing methods of prediction. Mathematics and medicine were studied in temples and schools, ensuring continuity of knowledge. Artisans produced glazed bricks, carved seals, and crafted jewellery that adorned both sacred and secular spaces. The prestige of Babylon attracted people from across the empire, making the city a melting pot of cultures and traditions. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not without challenges. His campaigns in the Levant required constant attention, as subject states rebelled and Egypt sought to reclaim influence. The long siege of Tyre, lasting more than a decade, demonstrates the persistence required to maintain Babylonian dominance. Internal tensions also existed, as the burdens of taxation and labour service weighed on the population. Yet Nebuchadnezzar's ability to hold the empire together for more than 4 decades testifies to his effectiveness as a ruler. His reign represents not only expansion, but consolidation, the creation of structures that endured beyond his lifetime. The memory of Nebuchadnezzar has been shaped by diverse traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, he is portrayed as both destroyer and instrument of divine will, the king who destroyed Jerusalem, yet also the one through whom God's purposes were accomplished. In Babylonian inscriptions, he is the devoted servant of Marduk, the builder of temples and the shepherd of his people. In later classical accounts, he appears as a mighty conqueror and a figure of awe. These varied portrayals reflect the impact of his reign on many peoples, for his actions touched communities from Mesopotamia to the Levant and left impressions that endured for centuries. The zenith of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was visible not only in its monuments and conquests, but in its sense of identity. The city was presented as the centre of the world, the dwelling of the gods, and the capital of empire. Its walls, its ziggurat, its temples and its palaces proclaimed its supremacy. Its rituals and festivals affirmed its cosmic significance. Its wealth and trade made it the envy of neighbours. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon embodied the idea of civilization itself, a model of grandeur that would echo in later imaginations as both ideal and cautionary tale. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, he left behind a strong empire and a city at the height of its splendour. His successors would struggle to maintain the momentum, and within decades the Neo-Babylonian dynasty would face decline and conquest. Yet his reign remains the high point of Babylonian history, the era when the city reached its fullest expression of power and magnificence. The legacy of Nebuchadnezzar ensured that Babylon would never be forgotten, even after its fall, for the memory of its walls, its gardens, and its gods lived on in texts, traditions, and ruins. From the zenith achieved under Nebuchadnezzar, the story of Babylon would move toward new challenges. The grandeur of empire could not shield it from the ambitions of powerful neighbours or the realities of succession disputes. The city that had risen to dominate the Near East would soon confront pressures that tested its endurance once again. Yet the achievements of Nebuchadnezzar remained a standard against which all later rulers would be measured, a reminder of the heights to which Babylon could rise when led by a determined and ambitious king. The reign of Nebuchadnezzar II had transformed Babylon into a metropolis, whose reputation spread far beyond Mesopotamia, a city that visitors described with awe, and whose memory endured for centuries after its decline. To understand why later generations spoke of Babylon as great, one must look not only at its walls, gates, and palaces, but also at the rhythms of life within them. The grandeur of the city was not only in its monumental architecture, but in its people, its markets, its rituals, and its daily activities. Babylon the Great was at once a political capital, a religious centre, an economic hub, and a lived environment where tens of thousands made their homes. The physical setting of Babylon contributed to its splendour. Situated on the Euphrates River, the city straddled both banks, connected by bridges and canals. Its walls stretched for miles, enclosing an area large enough to contain fields, gardens, and neighbourhoods alongside temples and palaces. Greek authors later exaggerated its size, speaking of walls more than 80 kilometres long, but even with exaggeration stripped away, Babylon was vast by ancient standards, among the largest cities of its time. The river ran through the centre, providing water for drinking, irrigation and transport. Canals branched outward, bringing fertility to the surrounding lands and linking the city to trade routes that extended across Mesopotamia. Entering Babylon was itself an experience of spectacle. The Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant glazed bricks in deep blue and its reliefs of lions, bulls and dragons, stood as both defence and display. Beyond it stretched the processional way, a broad avenue used during festivals but also part of daily traffic, where merchants, priests and travellers moved among the throngs. The sheer scale of the walls, said to be wide enough for chariots to pass each other on top, impressed all who saw them. Even if later descriptions magnified their dimensions, the impression of strength and majesty was real, for the walls symbolised both security and identity. Within these walls, Babylon bustled with activity. Markets filled the streets and squares, with stalls offering grain, dates, vegetables, fish and meat. Merchants sold textiles woven from wool, dyed in bright colours and embroidered with patterns. Pottery, tools and jewellery were displayed alongside imported goods brought from distant lands, timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia and Iran, spices from Arabia, and luxury items from as far as India. The diversity of goods reflected Babylon's role as a hub of long-distance trade, where caravans and ships converged. Silver served as the primary medium of exchange, weighed carefully in scales, though barter remained common in daily transactions. Contracts written on clay tablets recorded purchases, loans and partnerships, giving the market an air of both vibrancy and order. The variety of people in Babylon matched the variety of goods. Babylonians mingled with traders from Phoenicia, Aramea and Persia. Captives from conquests, including Judeans exiled after the fall of Jerusalem, became part of the population, working as labourers, artisans or scribes. Diplomats from foreign courts visited the city, bringing gifts and letters, while mercenaries from distant regions served in the Babylonian army. This cosmopolitan character gave Babylon both wealth and cultural richness. Languages from across the Near East were heard in its streets, though Akkadian and Aramaic dominated, the latter increasingly serving as the common tongue of trade and administration. Religion permeated daily life, with temples scattered across the city. The Asagila, dedicated to Marduk, was the most prominent, but shrines to Ishtar, Shamash, Nabu and other gods attracted worshippers. Each day, priests performed rituals presenting offerings of food, drink and incense to the divine statues. Families brought small sacrifices or prayers, seeking favour for health, fertility or protection. Festivals filled the calendar, with processions, music and communal feasting drawing the population into collective celebration. The Akitu, the New Year festival, was the most important, when statues of gods were paraded, hymns recited, and the king reaffirmed his legitimacy. These events were more than religious rituals. They were moments when the city itself reaffirmed its unity and order. The rhythm of work defined daily existence. Farmers in the surrounding fields cultivated barley, wheat and dates, delivering surplus to markets and temples. Fishermen plied the Euphrates, supplying fresh catches to urban households. Shepherds raised sheep and goats, providing wool for the thriving textile industry. Within the city, artisans practiced their crafts in workshops. Potters shaped clay, metalworkers forged tools and ornaments, stonecutters carved reliefs, and scribes inscribed tablets. Each occupation had its guilds or associations, preserving skills and regulating practices. Apprentices learned by serving masters, ensuring continuity across generations. Work was not only economic but social, binding individuals into networks of obligation and identity. Households formed the core of society. Houses varied in size, from modest one-room dwellings to larger homes with courtyards and multiple stories. Mud brick was the standard material, with wooden beams supporting roofs and walls plastered for protection. Courtyards provided space for cooking, storage, and family gatherings. Extended families often lived together, with grandparents, parents, children, and servants sharing the same dwelling. Marriage contracts, dowry agreements, and inheritance records found on tablets reveal the importance of family arrangements, as property and obligations were carefully negotiated. Women managed households, oversaw children, and participated in trade and property transactions, their roles essential though framed within a patriarchal structure. Education was valued, particularly for scribal families. Boys destined for scribal or priestly careers attended schools where they learned cuneiform and increasingly Aramaic writing. Their training began with simple signs and advanced to copying literary texts, legal documents, and mathematical tables. The curriculum included proverbs, hymns, and epics, instilling both technical skills and cultural values. Literacy remained limited to an elite minority, but its influence was immense, for scribes managed administration, preserved literature, and mediated between rulers and people. The presence of schools in temple precincts reinforced the connection between knowledge and religion, making education part of sacred duty. Law and order were maintained through courts and officials. Judges presided over disputes, consulting written contracts, calling witnesses, and invoking divine oaths. Theft, fraud, and assault were punished according to established penalties, ensuring that social trust was preserved. Contracts covered everything from loans and property sales to marriage and adoption, reflecting a society deeply concerned with regulation and predictability. Justice was not abstract but practical, aimed at maintaining balance and preventing conflict. Even in daily transactions, the presence of law was felt, for every agreement carried the weight of divine and royal authority. Entertainment and leisure filled spaces between work and ritual. Music was central, with lyres, drums, and flutes accompanying festivals and private gatherings. Storytelling preserved myths and epics, with the Epic of Gilgamesh and other tales recited in households and schools. Games such as dice and board games offered amusement, while feasting brought families and communities together. Beer brewed from barley was a staple of social life, consumed in households, taverns, and festivals. These pleasures gave colour to daily existence, balancing the demands of labour and devotion. The city's grandeur was not limited to monuments, but extended to its administration. Officials oversaw taxation, conscription, and distribution of resources. Records in cuneiform tablets track deliveries of grain, assignments of labour, and orders from the palace. Temples acted as economic centres, managing lands, storing goods, and providing rations. Palaces coordinated foreign relations, receiving envoys and dispatching correspondence. The bureaucracy that sustained Babylon was vast, staffed by scribes and overseen by nobles loyal to the king. This system allowed the city to function as both a capital of empire and a community of individuals. The splendour of Babylon struck outsiders as extraordinary. Greek travellers centuries later described its walls, gates, and ziggurat in glowing terms, though often with exaggeration. Biblical texts portrayed it as both mighty and corrupt, reflecting its role in the exile of Judeans. For those who lived within its walls, the city was home, its greatness experienced not only in monuments but in daily routines. The smell of bread from ovens, the sound of water flowing through canals, the sight of priests in procession, the chatter of markets, the cries of merchants, the laughter of children in courtyards, all formed part of the life of Babylon the Great. This grandeur, however, carried with it burdens. Heavy taxation supported the building projects and military campaigns. Labour obligations pressed on farmers and artisans, who were required to work on canals, walls, and temples. The presence of foreign captives and exiles testified to the harsh realities of conquest. Social divisions were sharp, with elites enjoying wealth while commoners struggled with subsistence. Yet these burdens were offset by the city's prosperity, which provided opportunities for trade, employment, and advancement. The greatness of Babylon was real but complex, sustained by the labour of many for the glory of the few. As the Neo-Babylonian Empire matured, Babylon's splendor became both its strength and its vulnerability. The wealth concentrated in the city made it the envy of rivals, while its symbolic power made it a target for conquerors. Yet for the moment, under Nebuchadnezzar and his immediate successors, Babylon stood unrivaled, the jewel of Mesopotamia, the city where gods dwelt and kings reigned supreme. Its splendor was not illusion, but a reality built in brick and clay, sustained by trade and labor, and celebrated in ritual and story. From the perspective of history, the Babylon of this period represents the fullest flowering of Mesopotamian civilization. It united ancient traditions with imperial ambition, producing a city that symbolized both continuity and innovation. Its daily life, preserved in tablets and ruins, reveals the humanity behind its monuments. Farmers, scribes, merchants, priests, and families who gave the city its substance. Their lives, woven into the fabric of Babylon the Great, ensured that the city was not only a symbol of power, but a living community. As time moved forward, Babylon's grandeur would continue to shape its destiny. The wealth and monuments that proclaimed its greatness also made it vulnerable to envy and conquest. The next stages of its history would bring both legend and upheaval, as the city's marvels became part of stories told far beyond Mesopotamia. Yet for those who walked its streets, worked in its fields, prayed in its temples, and traded in its markets, Babylon was not myth, but reality, a city of splendor and daily life, both extraordinary and ordinary at once. Among the many marvels attributed to Babylon, none captured the imagination of later generations more than the Hanging Gardens. They became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, remembered by Greek and Roman authors as a creation so extraordinary that they seem to transcend the boundaries of ordinary architecture. Terraces rising above the city, filled with trees and flowers, watered by ingenious mechanisms that lifted water high from the river. Such was the image preserved in classical texts. Yet the historical reality of the gardens remains elusive, debated by scholars, for the archaeological record has not produced definitive evidence of their existence in Babylon itself. Whether or not they stood as later described, the story of the Hanging Gardens reveals much about how Babylon was perceived, how Nebuchadnezzar's reign was remembered, and how ancient peoples constructed symbols of cultural greatness. The earliest descriptions of the gardens come not from Babylonian sources, but from Greek historians writing centuries later. Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE, gave a detailed account of the city's walls, gates, and temples, but did not mention the gardens. Later writers, however, including Strabo and Philo of Byzantium, offered vivid descriptions of a wonder that seemed to defy nature. They spoke of terraced platforms built of stone, rising like a mountain within the city, planted with trees that provided shade and fruit, irrigated by an elaborate system that raised water from the Euphrates. Diodorus Siculus, drawing on earlier sources, explained that Nebuchadnezzar had built the gardens for his queen, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. In this version, the gardens were not only an engineering achievement, but an act of royal devotion, blending personal love with imperial ambition. The contrast between the absence of Babylonian references and the detail of Greek accounts has long puzzled historians. Inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar emphasize his building of walls, temples and palaces, but none mention gardens of such scale. Archaeological excavations at Babylon have revealed vast palatial complexes, storerooms and walls, but no clear remains of terraced gardens. Some scholars have suggested that the gardens may have been located elsewhere, perhaps in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, where Sennacherib is known to have constructed elaborate terraced gardens with advanced irrigation. If so, the tradition may have been transferred from Assyria to Babylon in later memory, reflecting Babylon's reputation as the marvel of the ancient world. Regardless of their historical location, the association of the gardens with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon reflects how the city was imagined. Babylon symbolized grandeur, wealth, and the ability to reshape nature itself. The gardens embodied this vision, presenting an image of human ingenuity harnessing resources to create beauty and abundance. To Greeks accustomed to arid landscapes, the idea of a lush mountain of greenery rising within a city symbolized both luxury and the triumph of engineering. The gardens became a shorthand for Babylon's greatness, a symbol that transcended physical reality to express cultural perception. The technical details attributed to the gardens illustrate the fascination they inspired. Ancient authors described stone terraces waterproofed with bitumen and lead, covered with layers of soil deep enough to support large trees. They spoke of screw-like devices or chain pumps lifting water from the river to irrigate the plants, an image that anticipated later mechanical inventions. If such systems existed, they would have required constant maintenance, labour and resources, reflecting the wealth and organisation of the state. Whether or not these descriptions were based on direct observation, they reveal how ancient people conceived of technological marvels, blending plausible engineering with imaginative embellishment. The symbolic meaning of the gardens extended beyond their physical form. They represented the king's power to provide abundance, to turn arid plains into verdant landscapes. In a land where agriculture depended on irrigation and labour, the creation of an artificial paradise symbolised mastery over nature. They also represented royal generosity, for gardens were spaces of leisure, pleasure and feasting, enjoyed not only by the royal family, but by guests and dignitaries. In later retellings, the gardens became a metaphor for the prosperity of Babylon itself, a city so wealthy that it could cultivate mountains of greenery in the heart of the desert. For Babylonians themselves, gardens were familiar and important parts of life, though perhaps not on the legendary scale later imagined. Texts and archaeological evidence show that palace and temple complexes often included orchards, groves, and cultivated plots. Date palms, fig trees, and pomegranates provided fruit, while shade trees offered relief from the heat. These gardens were watered by canals and wells, maintained by labourers, and enjoyed by elites. They were spaces of relaxation, ritual, and prestige. Nebuchadnezzar's palaces likely contained such gardens, integrated into their courtyards and terraces. The later legend of the Hanging Gardens may have been an exaggeration of these real spaces, magnified in memory and transmitted through cultural exchange. The endurance of the Hanging Gardens in historical imagination reveals how legends can outlast physical structures. Even if no terraced wonder rose in Babylon, the association of the city with this marvel shaped its reputation. When later authors listed the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens stood alongside the Great Pyramid and the statue of Zeus, testifying to their symbolic power. The gardens were not merely a physical place, but a cultural construct, a way of expressing Babylon's greatness through imagery of abundance and ingenuity. Their presence in literature ensured that Babylon would be remembered not only as a city of conquest and power, but also as a city of beauty and marvel. The debate over the garden's existence continues among modern scholars, but the question itself reflects the fascination Babylon inspires. Archaeologists search for traces in ruins, historians analyse texts, engineers reconstruct possible irrigation systems, and philologists trace words across languages. Each attempt reveals more about how ancient societies recorded memory and attributed wonders. Whether in Babylon or Nineveh, whether as reality or myth, the Hanging Gardens remain a lens through which to view the ancient world's imagination and the enduring prestige of Babylon. The story of the gardens also reveals the blending of personal and political in kingship. The legend that Nebuchadnezzar built them for his queen reflects the expectation that kings should provide for their households and express devotion through monumental acts. At the same time, such an undertaking proclaimed the wealth and power of the empire, impressing both subjects and foreign visitors. In this sense, the gardens, like temples and walls, were part of the ideology of kingship, material expressions of authority framed as acts of care. The personal and the political were inseparable. intertwined in the narratives preserved by later generations. For those who lived in Babylon, the presence of gardens, whether terraced marvels or more modest orchards, would have been part of the urban landscape. Children played in shaded courtyards, women gathered fruit from groves, priests performed rituals in temple gardens, and nobles dined in palatial orchards. The scent of flowers, the taste of fruit, and the sound of water flowing through channels were not only luxuries but reminders of prosperity and divine favour. The real gardens of Babylon provided joy and sustenance, even if the legendary hanging gardens existed only in the imagination. The association of Babylon with the hanging gardens endured because it captured the essence of the city's reputation. Babylon was not only powerful but wealthy, not only disciplined but extravagant, not only devoted to its gods but capable of reshaping the natural world. The gardens symbolise this duality, presenting Babylon as both formidable and wondrous. Even as the city declined and fell to foreign powers, the memory of the hanging gardens ensured that its image remained splendid in the eyes of posterity. As Babylon's history moved forward, the reality of its struggles contrasted with the legends that surrounded it. While the city faced succession disputes, external threats, and eventual conquest, outsiders continued to imagine it as a place of marvels. The hanging gardens became part of that imagined legacy, shaping how later civilizations thought about Babylon. The gap between history and legend was wide, but both contributed to the city's enduring fame. The legend of the gardens also points toward the fragility of memory. What was once described with such detail by Greek authors remains unconfirmed by archaeology. Ruins crumble, inscriptions are lost, but stories endure. In this way, the Hanging Gardens remind us that history is not only what happened, but what people believed, what they told, and what they remembered. Babylon's greatness was measured not only in bricks and stones, but in tales that crossed centuries. The Hanging Gardens stand therefore as a symbol of Babylon's place in the human imagination. Whether or not they rose in terraces above the city, they grew in the minds of those who heard of Babylon's splendour. They testify to the power of narrative, the allure of marvels, and the enduring association of Babylon with wonder. As Babylon's story continued into decline and conquest, the gardens remained a reminder of its height, a legend that ensured the city would never be forgotten. Behind the walls, the markets, the gardens, and the palaces of Babylon lay the rhythms of religion, the constant cycle of rituals and festivals that gave meaning to the life of the city and legitimacy to its rulers. Religion was not a separate sphere of existence, but the framework in which every aspect of Babylonian society was understood. Agriculture, trade, kingship, justice, and daily life all operated within the order believed to have been established by the gods. The grandeur of Babylon as a city was inseparable from its sacred character, for it was not only a capital of empire but also the dwelling place of the gods, above all Marduk, whose supremacy had been affirmed over centuries of tradition. The rituals performed within its temples were not private acts of devotion, but public events that bound community, state, and cosmos together in visible form. The priesthood was at the centre of this religious world. Priests managed temples, performed rituals, and oversaw the presentation of offerings. Their authority extended beyond the sacred, for they controlled lands, collected rents, and supervised labourers attached to temple estates. They were scribes, economists, and administrators as much as they were religious figures. In the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, the high priest and his colleagues maintained daily offerings, washing, clothing, and feeding the statue of the god. These acts were not symbolic, but believed to sustain the deity's presence, ensuring his favour for the city. The statue itself was treated as a living being, its well-being reflecting the well-being of Babylon. Priests recited hymns, burned incense, and offered food in carefully prescribed rituals, repeating traditions that linked the present to a divine order stretching back to creation itself. Festivals punctuated the calendar, the most important of which was the Akitu, the New Year festival held at the beginning of spring. This celebration lasted 12 days and involved a sequence of elaborate rituals, processions and ceremonies. It began with purification rites in temples, followed by the presentation of offerings to Marduk and other gods. Statues of deities from surrounding cities were brought into Babylon, affirming the city's centrality in the divine order. The highlight of the festival came when the king himself participated directly in the rituals. In the presence of the high priest, the king was required to humble himself before Marduk's statue, surrendering the symbols of his authority. The priest would strike him and force him to swear that he had ruled justly, without neglecting his duties to the gods or oppressing his people. Only after this humiliation could the king's regalia be returned and his legitimacy reaffirmed. The ritual dramatized the principle that royal authority was conditional, dependent on the approval of Marduk. Even the most powerful king was ultimately servant to the god of Babylon. The Akitu also involved processions through the city and beyond its walls. Statues of the gods were carried along the processional way, the great avenue lined with decorated bricks, while crowds gathered to witness and participate. Music, hymns and sacrifices accompanied the movement, filling the city with sound and spectacle. The journey extended to the House of the Festival, a special temple outside the walls, symbolizing the renewal of cosmic order as the gods travelled and returned. These processions connected the divine world to the physical city, bringing gods into visible relationship with their people. The Akitu was not only a religious celebration, but a civic event, reinforcing Babylon's identity and unity. Other festivals honoured specific deities or marked seasonal cycles. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, received offerings during rituals that emphasized fertility and abundance. Shamash, the sun god, was honoured in ceremonies that underscored his role as guardian of justice. Nabu, associated with writing and wisdom, drew worshippers to his cult centres, particularly during festivals celebrating scribal achievements. Each god had a calendar of rituals, managed by priests and supported by temple resources. These celebrations linked the rhythms of agriculture, astronomy and politics into a unified sacred order. Priests and temple staff were organised hierarchically, with specialised roles. Diviners interpreted omens from animal entrails, oil patterns and celestial phenomena, offering guidance to rulers and communities. Exorcists performed rituals to ward off evil spirits and disease, combining incantations with practical remedies. Musicians accompanied ceremonies with lyres, drums and flutes, creating an atmosphere of reverence and joy. Scribes recorded rituals, copied hymns, and preserved liturgical texts, ensuring continuity across generations. Each role contributed to the functioning of the temple as both a sacred and administrative institution. The connection between kingship and religion was fundamental. Babylonian kings styled themselves as chosen by the gods, especially Marduk, and their legitimacy was constantly reinforced through ritual. Inscriptions often depict kings as builders and restorers of temples, emphasizing their piety as proof of their right to rule. By constructing or repairing temples, kings demonstrated devotion and ensured divine favor. Nebuchadnezzar II, for example, repeatedly proclaimed in his inscriptions that he had rebuilt temples for the gods, presenting himself as servant and protector of Marduk. Kingship was sacred kingship, not a matter of personal ambition alone, but of cosmic order. The rituals of festivals like the Akitu dramatized this relationship, ensuring that royal power was always framed as service to the divine. The rituals of Babylon extended into daily life. Families placed small statues of gods in their homes, offered prayers at household shrines, and sought the protection of protective spirits. Amulets inscribed with divine names or images were worn to ward off harm. Ordinary people consulted diviners and healers, blending spiritual and practical remedies for illness or misfortune. Births, marriages, and deaths were accompanied by rituals that connected individual lives to the larger order of the gods. In this way, religion permeated every level of society. from the grand festivals of the city to the quiet devotions of households. Divination played a particularly prominent role in Babylonian religion, reflecting the belief that the gods communicated their will through signs. Celestial events such as eclipses, conjunctions, and unusual star patterns were carefully recorded and interpreted as omens for the king and the state. The liver of a sacrificed animal was examined for markings believed to reveal divine messages. Dreams were analysed, with handbooks providing guidance on their meanings. This system of divination provided rulers with counsel, reinforced the authority of priests, and shaped decisions in war, diplomacy, and administration. The boundary between religion and science blurred. For astronomical observation, medical diagnosis, and ritual incantation all formed part of the same search for divine knowledge. The economic dimension of religion was also significant. Temples owned vast estates, cultivated by dependent labourers and managed by administrators. They collected offerings of grain, animals, and silver, redistributing them through rations and payments. Temples acted as storage centres, banks, and employers, integrating religion into the material life of the city. This economic role reinforced their social power, for priests and temple officials wielded influence not only as religious figures, but as economic managers. Their wealth supported the elaborate rituals and festivals that defined Babylonian identity. The visual and auditory experience of Babylonian rituals added to their power. The sight of gilded statues carried through the streets, the sound of hymns chanted in unison, the smell of incense filling the air, the taste of food shared in communal feasts, all engaged the senses, creating a collective experience that bound people to their gods and each other. Rituals were not abstract doctrines, but embodied practices, lived and felt by participants. This sensory richness ensured that religion remained central to Babylonian life, shaping memory and identity through repeated performance. The endurance of Babylon's religious system through centuries of political change testifies to its resilience. Whether under Kassite, Assyrian, or Neo-Babylonian rulers, the rituals of Marduk and other gods continued, preserving continuity amidst turmoil. Even foreign conquerors recognized the necessity of honouring Babylon's gods. Assyrian kings who destroyed parts of the city later rebuilt its temples, and Cyrus of Persia, after conquering Babylon, presented himself as chosen by Marduk, legitimizing his rule through Babylonian tradition. The rituals of religion were stronger than any dynasty, for they expressed the enduring structure of Babylonian culture. Religion in Babylon was therefore not merely belief, but practice, not merely private, but public, not merely symbolic, but material. It organised time, legitimised power, structured society, and shaped daily life. From the humbling of kings in the Akitu festival to the prayers whispered in household shrines, religion was the fabric of Babylonian identity. The city's greatness was measured not only in its walls and gardens, but in its rituals, through which Babylonians experienced the presence of their gods and affirmed their place in the cosmos. As Babylon entered the later years of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, these rituals remained central, even as political tensions grew. The stability provided by religion could not shield the city from succession disputes, foreign threats, and the ambitions of Persia. Yet the persistence of festivals and priestly authority ensured that Babylon retained its sacred character until the very end. When conquerors came, they did not abolish Babylonian religion but appropriated it, demonstrating its enduring power. The rituals of Babylon outlasted its kings, ensuring that the city's identity remained anchored in the service of the gods. The splendour of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and the rituals that bound its society together could not prevent the difficulties that followed his death. His successors struggled to maintain the stability of the empire, and within a generation the city that had stood at the height of its power faced decline. The later rulers of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty were marked by short reigns, succession disputes, and policies that alienated parts of the population. While the monuments and traditions of Babylon remained strong, the political foundations began to weaken. Into this environment stepped Nabonidus, the last independent king of Babylon, whose reign from 556 to 539 BCE brought innovation but also controversy. His decisions, combined with the rising strength of Persia under Cyrus the Great, set the stage for the city's conquest and transformation into a province of a new empire. Nabonidus came to power through intrigue, not direct descent from Nebuchadnezzar. His background was unusual, and his policies even more so. Unlike his predecessors, who had consistently emphasized their devotion to Marduk, Nabonidus showed particular preference for the moon god Sin. He spent much of his reign away from Babylon, residing in the oasis city of Tama, Arabia, for reasons that remain debated. Some suggest he sought to control trade routes, others that he was ill or alienated from the Babylonian priesthood. Whatever the cause, his absence from Babylon created tension, especially because it left the rituals of the city disrupted. The Akitu festival, which required the king's presence, could not be performed properly, and the priests of Marduk grew resentful. Nabonidus continued to rule through officials and his son Belshazzar, but his unusual behaviour weakened the unity of the kingdom. While Babylon struggled with internal discord, a new power was rising in the east. The Persians, an Iranian people once subordinate to the Medes, had united under Cyrus II. In 550 BCE, Cyrus overthrew the Median king Astyages, incorporating the Median realm into his own. He then turned westward, defeating the powerful kingdom of Lydia in Asia Minor and extending Persian control to the Aegean coast. By the 540s, Cyrus had created an empire that stretched from Anatolia to the Iranian plateau, and Babylon lay directly in his path. The city's prestige, wealth, and central location made it an irresistible target, and its internal divisions made it vulnerable. The campaign that brought Persia to Babylon unfolded quickly. In 539 BCE, Cyrus launched his invasion of Babylonia, advancing along the Euphrates. The Babylonian army met him at Opis, north of the city, but was decisively defeated. Ancient sources describe slaughter and looting in the aftermath, a clear sign that Babylon's military could not withstand Persia's disciplined forces. Soon after, Sippar, another important city, surrendered without resistance. The road to Babylon lay open, and Cyrus pressed forward. The actual capture of Babylon became legendary, retold in various ways by different traditions. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a cuneiform text written by Babylonian scribes, records that the city fell without battle. Cyrus's troops entered Babylon peacefully, and the city's population welcomed him. The Greek historian Herodotus later claimed that the Persians diverted the Euphrates, lowering the water level so that soldiers could march into the city along the riverbed, entering through unguarded gates. Xenophon offered another version, suggesting a surprise attack during a festival. These differing accounts reflect both the drama of the event and the propaganda of its retelling. What seems certain is that resistance within Babylon was minimal, and that Cyrus secured the city with remarkable speed. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator. In the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay inscription often called the First Charter of Human Rights, he described how Marduk had chosen him to rule Babylon after Nabonidus failed in his duties. The text claims that Cyrus restored proper worship, returned displaced populations to their homelands, and rebuilt temples. Whether or not these claims were entirely accurate, they reveal the strategy Cyrus used to legitimize his rule. By aligning himself with Babylonian religious traditions, especially the cult of Marduk, he gained acceptance from the priesthood and the population. His conquest was framed not as foreign domination, but as restoration of divine order. The Persian administration quickly integrated Babylon into its empire. Cyrus and his successors allowed the city to maintain its temples, festivals, and local elites. Priests continued to perform rituals, scribes continued to copy texts, and merchants continued to trade. Babylon remained a major centre of culture and economy, its prestige preserved even under foreign rule. The Persians recognised the value of Babylonian knowledge, drawing upon its astronomy, mathematics and scribal traditions. Babylonian scholars recorded astronomical diaries that became important for Persian administration and later Greek science. The city's continuity under Persia reflects both the adaptability of Babylonian traditions and the pragmatism of Persian policy. Economically, Babylon remained prosperous. Its fertile lands produced grain and dates, its artisans supplied goods for local and imperial markets, and its merchants connected Mesopotamia to broader trade networks. Silver continued to serve as the medium of exchange, and contracts written on cuneiform tablets reveal ongoing transactions in land, loans, and partnerships. The Persian kings imposed tribute but allowed local practices to continue, ensuring stability. The resources of Babylonia contributed significantly to the wealth of the Achaemenid Empire, sustaining its armies and palaces. Culturally, Babylon retained its role as a centre of tradition. The temples of Esagila and Etemenanki continued to function, supported by royal patronage. Priests recited hymns, performed rituals, and maintained archives. Scribal schools trained students in cuneiform, preserving literature and knowledge. Even as Aramaic increasingly replaced Akkadian as the spoken and administrative language, Babylonian culture persisted. The coexistence of Persian authority and Babylonian tradition created a synthesis that allowed the city to thrive under new rulers. Yet the conquest also marked a turning point. Babylon was no longer the capital of an independent empire, but a province within a larger imperial system. Its rulers were absent kings based in Persia, who visited occasionally but did not reside in the city. The political autonomy that had once allowed Babylon to project power across the Near East was gone. Its priests and elites adapted, but they no longer controlled destiny. The city's role was preserved but transformed, from sovereign power to honoured but subordinate centre. The memory of Babylon's fall entered many traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus was celebrated as deliverance, for it allowed the return of exiled Judeans to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. Prophetic texts cast Cyrus as an instrument of God's will, chosen to end Babylon's oppression. For Babylonians themselves, the conquest was remembered as the restoration of order after Nabonidus's disruption. For Persians, it was a triumph that showcased their king's ability to win cities not only by force but by diplomacy and legitimacy. Each tradition emphasized different aspects, but all recognized the significance of the event. The conquest of Babylon also symbolized the shift of power from Mesopotamia to Persia. For more than a millennium, Mesopotamian cities had dominated the political and cultural life of the Near East. With Cyrus, the centre moved eastward to an empire that spanned continents. Babylon remained important, but it was no longer the driving force of history. Its knowledge and prestige were absorbed into a larger whole, contributing to the Achaemenid synthesis that blended Mesopotamian, Persian, and other traditions. Despite the loss of independence, Babylon under Persian rule remained vibrant. Its festivals continued to draw crowds, its markets bustled with trade, and its scholars recorded the movements of planets and stars. Cyrus and his successors recognized that the strength of their empire depended on respecting local traditions, and in Babylon this policy ensured continuity. The city's decline would come later, under new conquerors less patient with its autonomy. For the moment, Babylon remained great, though no longer sovereign, a city whose identity persisted even as its political role changed. The conquest by Cyrus marks a decisive moment in Babylon's story. It ended the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, integrated the city into a vast new empire, and redefined its place in the world. Yet it did not erase Babylon's traditions or significance. The rituals of Marduk continued, the scribes of Babylon wrote, and the memory of its greatness endured. The city's adaptability ensured that it remained a centre of culture, even when political power shifted elsewhere. As Persia extended its reach, Babylon became one of the jewels of the empire, a city respected for its antiquity and prestige. The Persians understood that to rule the Near East they had to rule Babylon, not by destroying it, but by incorporating it. The conquest thus illustrates both the fragility of political power and the resilience of cultural identity. Babylon fell, but Babylon endured, its legacy carried forward in the empires that followed. When Cyrus entered Babylon and made it part of the Persian Empire, the city retained much of its importance. Temples continued to operate, rituals were preserved, and scribes maintained the traditions of cuneiform learning. Under the earlier Achaemenid rulers, Babylon even flourished, serving as a key administrative and economic centre. Yet the very fact that its kings now lived far away in Susa or Persepolis foreshadowed a gradual change. Babylon was still respected, even honoured, but it was no longer the seat of imperial power. This shift became more pronounced in the centuries that followed, as new conquerors arrived from the west. The Greeks under Alexander the Great, the Seleucids who inherited his empire, and eventually the Parthians from Iran each controlled Babylon, and each left their mark. Over time, the city that had once been the unrivalled capital of Mesopotamia became one centre among many, and while its traditions persisted, they began to fade under the weight of foreign dominance and cultural change. The arrival of Alexander the Great in 331 BCE marked a dramatic moment in Babylon's history. Having defeated Darius III of Persia at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander marched south to claim the Persian capitals. Babylon, still rich and prestigious, surrendered without resistance. Ancient accounts describe Alexander entering the city in triumph, greeted by crowds and welcomed into its palaces. For Alexander, Babylon was more than a prize of conquest. It was a symbol of legitimacy. By occupying it, he presented himself as heir to both Persian and Mesopotamian traditions. He offered sacrifices to Marduk, restoring rituals that had lapsed under Persian rule, and presented himself as protector of the temples. In this way, he followed the pattern established by earlier conquerors, recognizing that to rule Babylon was to align with its gods and traditions. Alexander's vision for Babylon was ambitious. He intended to make it one of the capitals of his empire, a centre from which he could govern east and west alike. He ordered repairs to its temples and palaces, planned new construction, and used the city as his administrative base while organising campaigns further east. Babylon became a gathering place for troops, merchants, and envoys from across his empire. Yet Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar itself brought an end to these plans. His death in Babylon gave the city a unique place in his story, remembered as the place where the great conqueror's career ended. The body of Alexander was taken elsewhere, but the memory of his final days tied Babylon to the legacy of Hellenism. In the turmoil that followed Alexander's death, Babylon became a contested prize among his generals. At first it fell under the control of Seleucus, one of the Diadochi, who would eventually establish the Seleucid Empire. Before Seleucus secured his position, Babylon was fought over repeatedly, suffering from sieges, plunder, and shifting garrisons. These conflicts weakened the city, disrupting its population and damaging its infrastructure. When Seleucus finally consolidated control, he sought to establish a new capital at Seleucia on the Tigris, only a few dozen kilometres away. This decision reflected both the prestige of Babylon and its limitations. Seleucia offered easier access to trade routes and military lines, while Babylon, with its old temples and priesthoods, represented a tradition that did not fully align with Greek models of kingship and urban life. The foundation of Seleucia marked the beginning of Babylon's decline. Many inhabitants, including merchants and administrators, were relocated or drawn to the new city. Seleucia grew quickly, becoming the dominant urban centre of the region, while Babylon lost population and vitality. Temples continued to function, supported by Seleucid patronage, but their resources diminished. Cuneiform continued to be written, but increasingly it was confined to priestly circles, while Greek became the language of administration and culture. Over time, the scribal schools dwindled, and the transmission of Babylonian literature slowed. The coexistence of Babylonian and Hellenistic traditions produced a hybrid culture, but it also eroded the central role Babylon had once held. Despite this decline, Babylon remained significant during the Seleucid period. Kings visited the city, offered sacrifices to Marduk, and sought the support of its priesthood. Astronomical diaries and other cuneiform texts show that Babylonian scholars continued to observe the skies, record events, and interpret omens well into the Hellenistic era. These texts reveal both continuity and change. They preserve traditions that have been maintained for centuries, but they also reflect the gradual shift of focus from Babylon to Seleucia and other centres. By the 2nd century BCE, Babylon was no longer the unrivalled centre of learning and ritual, but it still retained enough importance to be mentioned in royal inscriptions and visited by foreign envoys. The Parthians, who rose to power in Iran in the mid-3rd century BCE and eventually replaced the Seleucids in Mesopotamia, inherited Babylon as part of their dominion. Their approach to the city was pragmatic. They did not seek to transform it, but to use it as one of several urban centres in their empire. Babylon continued to exist, but it was overshadowed by other cities, including Seleucia and later Ctesiphon, which became the Parthian capital. The temples of Babylon still functioned for a time, and priests continued to record rituals and astronomical observations. But by this period, the decline was clear. Population shrank, buildings fell into disrepair, and cuneiform writing, once the medium of empire, gradually ceased to be used. The last known cuneiform tablets date from the 1st century CE, produced by Babylonian priests who still recorded astronomical data. These final echoes of a tradition stretching back to Sumer show both the persistence and the fragility of Babylonian culture. Once the scribal schools ended, the knowledge encoded in cuneiform was lost until rediscovered in the modern era. The decline of cuneiform coincided with the decline of Babylon itself, as the city lost inhabitants and vitality. By the time classical authors such as Strabo described it, Babylon was already partly in ruins, a shadow of its former self. The symbolic power of Babylon, however, remained immense. In Jewish and Christian texts, it continued to represent arrogance, exile, and judgment. In Greek and Roman literature, it appeared as a place of wonder and excess. Even as its physical reality diminished, its image grew in cultural memory. The hanging gardens, the walls, the ziggurat, all became symbols of a city that once embodied greatness. The irony of Babylon's decline was that its fame increased even as its streets emptied and its temples crumbled. The centuries of Greek, Seleucid, and Parthian rule illustrate the transformation of Babylon from imperial capital to provincial city, from living centre to cultural symbol. Each regime recognised its prestige, but each also contributed to its decline by favouring new cities and shifting resources. The priests and scribes of Babylon preserved traditions as long as they could, but eventually the momentum of change overwhelmed them. What endured was not the city itself, but its legacy, carried in texts, stories, and memories. The story of Babylon under foreign rule is therefore one of persistence and loss. It persisted in rituals, in scholarship, and in memory, but it lost its central role in the political and cultural life of the Near East. Its decline was gradual, not sudden, unfolding over centuries as new powers rose and redirected the currents of history. Yet even in decline, Babylon remained Babylon, a name that evoked awe, a city remembered long after its walls fell silent. As Parthian rule continued, Babylon faded further, while Ctesiphon rose as the great city of Mesopotamia. The once mighty metropolis became a collection of villages and ruins, visited by travellers who marvelled at its remnants. The story of Babylon was not finished, for later conquerors and chroniclers would keep its memory alive, but its role as a living city of empire was over. From this point forward, Babylon would live more in legend than in reality. its legacy enduring even as its streets grew quiet. By the time the Parthians controlled Mesopotamia, Babylon had already lost much of its vitality. The city that had once stood at the centre of empire, filled with palaces, temples, and bustling markets, was reduced to a diminished settlement overshadowed by newer capitals. Seleucia on the Tigris had drawn away its population, while later Ctesiphon rose as the seat of Parthian and then Sasanian kings. Babylon's name still carried prestige, but its reality was one of depopulation, crumbling monuments, and fading traditions. The decline was not sudden, but gradual, unfolding over centuries until the city that had once embodied Mesopotamian civilization became little more than ruins scattered across the plain. The process of decline can be traced in both texts and archaeology. The last cuneiform tablets from Babylon date from the 1st century of the Common Era. These were astronomical diaries, continuing the tradition of observing the skies that had lasted for more than a millennium. They were written by priests who still served in the temples, preserving rituals and knowledge even as the community around them diminished. After these final tablets, cuneiform disappeared, the script forgotten until rediscovered in the modern age. With the end of cuneiform, the continuous link to Babylon's intellectual heritage was broken. What survived were memories, passed through other languages and traditions, while the physical city slipped further into decay. Classical authors who visited Babylon during its decline provide stark descriptions. Strabo in the early 1st century BCE described the city as largely deserted, with much of it turned into farmland. Pliny the Elder in the 1st century CE spoke of Babylon as a memory of greatness rather than a living reality. Later writers described ruins, empty walls, and abandoned temples. These accounts show how quickly the city's physical presence diminished once political power and population shifted elsewhere. The great walls, once symbols of security and majesty, became silent markers of a lost age, while temples that had housed gods and priests fell into disrepair. The shift of capitals was decisive. When Seleucus founded Seleucia on the Tigris, he diverted resources, population, and administration away from Babylon. Seleucia grew into a thriving Hellenistic city, while Babylon dwindled. Under the Parthians, Ctesiphon, located near Seleucia, became the primary seat of power. These newer cities absorbed the energy that Babylon had once commanded. While Babylon remained a symbolic site, even used occasionally as a garrison or administrative point, it could not compete with the vitality of its rivals. Its location on the Euphrates, once an advantage, was less central than the Tigris corridor, where new trade and military routes converged. Geography, politics, and culture combined to push Babylon to the margins. Religion, once the lifeblood of Babylon, also faded. The great temples continued to function for a time under foreign rule, supported by royal patronage, but eventually they too fell silent. The cult of Marduk, which had given Babylon its identity, lost prominence as new religions spread across the region. Zoroastrianism shaped the Persian and later Sasanian empires, while Hellenistic and local cults took hold in Seleucid and Parthian cities. By the time Christianity began to spread in Mesopotamia, Babylon was already a ruin, remembered in scripture as a symbol of arrogance and downfall rather than experienced as a living community. The rituals that had once bound city and cosmos together became memories, their texts buried in the earth, unread for centuries. The population of Babylon dwindled gradually. Families moved to more prosperous towns, merchants followed trade routes that bypassed the city, and priests relocated to centres where their services were needed. By late antiquity, Babylon was no longer a city but a collection of villages scattered among the ruins of its former grandeur. Farmers cultivated fields where temples once stood, and shepherds grazed animals among crumbling walls. Travellers occasionally visited, marvelling at the scale of the ruins and retelling stories of the city's former greatness, but no serious attempt was made to revive it. The cycle of silt, erosion, and neglect completed what politics had begun, turning Babylon into a ghost of itself. The symbolic power of Babylon's decline was immense. In Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic traditions, Babylon became a symbol of hubris, idolatry, and divine judgment. Biblical texts spoke of its fall as punishment, presenting it as the archetype of arrogance brought low. In the Book of Revelation, Babylon was used as a metaphor for corrupt power destined for destruction. These associations ensured that Babylon lived on in memory even as its ruins crumbled. The actual city disappeared, but its name became a lasting image of both greatness and downfall, a cautionary tale that transcended its physical existence. Archaeological evidence confirms the gradual abandonment. Excavations show layers of habitation shrinking over time, with fewer houses, smaller workshops, and reduced activity. The once grand palaces and temples show signs of reuse, collapse, and neglect. Bricks from old walls were carried away to build newer structures elsewhere, recycling the materials of greatness into the needs of modest villages. Water management, once the pride of Babylonian engineering, broke down, leaving fields less fertile and canals clogged. Without the constant labour of a large population and the resources of an empire, the city could not sustain itself. Yet even in decline, Babylon continued to attract interest. Emperors and conquerors occasionally visited the ruins, drawn by their fame. When Alexander the Great had died in the city centuries earlier, he had cemented its place in Hellenistic memory. Later rulers, hearing of its past, sometimes considered rebuilding it, though none followed through. By the Roman period, Babylon was already an antiquity, a relic rather than a living city. Writers spoke of its ruins as testimony to the impermanence of human ambition, a theme that resonated across cultures. The slow decline of Babylon illustrates how cities die not through a single catastrophe, but through centuries of erosion. Political shifts move capitals elsewhere. Economic patterns redirect trade. Religious traditions fade and populations drift. What remains are ruins, memories, and stories. Babylon's fall was not like the sack of Nineveh, sudden and violent. It was a long fading, a transformation from imperial capital to forgotten site. This slow death ensured that its memory could be reshaped by later generations, free from the constraints of living reality. By late antiquity, Babylon had ceased to exist as a functioning city. Its ruins, however, remained visible, and they continued to inspire awe. Travellers described them, scriptures invoked them, and stories magnified them. The ziggurat, once towering, became the stuff of legend, remembered as the Tower of Babel. The walls, once impregnable, became symbols of futility. The name of Babylon lived on not because of what it was in its final centuries, but because of what it had been in its prime. The ruins served as reminders of both human achievement and its fragility. The end of Babylon as a living city was not the end of its story. Its memory endured across cultures, shaping imaginations for millennia. The slow decline that reduced it to ruins also elevated it into symbol. From imperial capital to forgotten settlement, Babylon's transformation illustrates the passage of civilizations, the inevitability of change, and the endurance of memory. What remained was not the bustling markets or the festivals of Marduk, but the image of a city once great, now silent, serving as both inspiration and warning for those who came after. When Babylon's streets grew quiet and its temples fell into ruin, the city did not vanish from history. Its walls may have collapsed, its ziggurat may have crumbled, and its palaces may have been dismantled brick by brick. But Babylon endured in another form. It became a memory, a symbol, and eventually a subject of rediscovery. Long after the last cuneiform tablet was written and the last ritual was performed in Marduk's temple, Babylon lived on in the minds of those who told stories, wrote scriptures, and searched ruins. Its eternal legacy lay not only in what it once was, but in how it was remembered, imagined, and reinterpreted by later generations. The earliest afterlife of Babylon was shaped by those who had experienced its power directly. For the peoples of the Levant, especially the Judeans taken into exile after Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem, Babylon was remembered as both a place of suffering and the instrument of divine judgment. Biblical texts recorded the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile as central events, and Babylon became the symbol of foreign domination. Yet the same text also presented Cyrus's conquest of Babylon as liberation, recasting the city as both oppressor and stepping stone to restoration. In the Hebrew Bible, Babylon appears repeatedly as an image of arrogance and downfall, a city that stood in opposition to divine will and was destined for ruin. These depictions ensured that Babylon's memory was preserved long after the city itself declined, shaping how it would be perceived in Western religious traditions. In later Jewish and Christian writings, Babylon took on even more symbolic weight. In the Book of Revelation, Babylon was portrayed as the great harlot, the city of sin and corruption destined to be destroyed. This image did not refer to the ruins in Mesopotamia, but to Rome, yet the name Babylon carried such power that it could stand as a metaphor for oppressive empires everywhere. By becoming a symbol rather than a physical city, Babylon achieved a kind of immortality, woven into theological and moral frameworks that persisted for centuries. Its negative image as a place of pride, idolatry, and downfall overshadowed its achievements in law, science, and architecture, but it ensured that Babylon was never forgotten. Islamic traditions also preserved Babylon's name and reputation. The Quran mentions Babylon in connection with magic and the figures Harut and Marut, angels who taught forbidden knowledge as a test. Medieval Islamic writers repeated stories about Babylon's ruins and associated it with legendary towers. These accounts reflected both knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia and the incorporation of Babylon into broader cultural narratives about hubris, divine punishment, and hidden wisdom. For Muslims, as for Jews and Christians, Babylon symbolized more than a historical city. It embodied ideas about morality, empire, and human ambition. Classical authors provided another stream of memory. Greek and Roman writers described Babylon as a place of marvels, emphasizing its walls, its gardens, and its ziggurat. Herodotus, though not entirely reliable, gave a detailed account of its layout, its gates, and its rituals. Later authors, drawing on travellers' tales and earlier sources, embellished the descriptions, portraying Babylon as a city of extraordinary size and wealth. For them, Babylon was a wonder of the East, a place that symbolized the grandeur and exoticism of Mesopotamia. These accounts preserved a more neutral or even admiring image of the city, balancing the condemnations found in religious texts. Together, they ensured that Babylon remained a subject of fascination throughout antiquity. As centuries passed, the ruins of Babylon continued to be visible, though less understood. Travellers in the Middle Ages described mounds of brick and earth near the Euphrates, often identifying them with biblical Babylon. Some associated the ruins with the Tower of Babel, believing that the crumbling ziggurat was the remnant of the tower built in pride and destroyed by God. These identifications, though not always accurate, kept the memory of Babylon alive in popular imagination. Pilgrims, scholars, and adventurers all speculated about the city, blending fragments of ancient history with legend and scripture. The physical ruins and the textual memories reinforced each other, creating a layered legacy that was as much myth as history. The rediscovery of Babylon in modern times transformed these memories into knowledge. In the 19th century, European explorers and archaeologists began systematic investigations of Mesopotamia. Travellers such as Claudius Rich described the ruins, while later expeditions uncovered the foundations of walls, temples, and palaces. The decipherment of cuneiform in the mid-19th century unlocked the ability to read Babylon's own records, revealing a wealth of information about its kings, its laws, its rituals, and its daily life. The recovery of Hammurabi's code, Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions, and astronomical diaries restored Babylon's voice after millennia of silence. What had been a city of legend became once again a subject of history. Excavations at Babylon itself, led by figures such as Robert Coldewey in the early 20th century, uncovered the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the remains of a Temenanki, the great ziggurat. The discovery of glazed bricks, inscriptions, and architectural layouts confirmed and corrected ancient descriptions. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in part in museums, became a tangible reminder of Babylon's artistry. These excavations showed that behind the myths lay real achievements of engineering and design. The rediscovery of Babylon rebalanced its image, reminding the world that it was not only a city of arrogance and downfall, but also a cradle of civilization, law, and science. Babylon's modern rediscovery also raised questions of preservation and identity. The ruins, located in present-day Iraq, became part of national heritage. They were visited by travellers, studied by scholars, and invoked in cultural memory. At times, political leaders sought to associate themselves with Babylon's legacy, using it to project continuity and greatness. These appropriations showed that Babylon remained a powerful symbol, capable of shaping identity thousands of years after its decline. The ruins, though fragile, continued to inspire, reminding all who saw them of the city that once claimed to be the centre of the world. The legacy of Babylon also lived on in language and culture. Words derived from its name appear in many traditions, often carrying meanings of confusion, arrogance, or splendour. The term Babel became associated with the story of the tower and the scattering of languages symbolising diversity and division. In art, literature and music, Babylon continued to appear as a subject, sometimes as a place of beauty, sometimes as a warning of corruption. Its image shifted depending on context, but its presence never disappeared. Babylon became a symbol so versatile that it could mean almost anything: pride or punishment, beauty or sin, marvel or ruin. The rediscovery of Babylon also influenced modern scholarship. Historians, archaeologists and linguists reconstructed its chronology, mapped its dynasties, and analysed its contributions to law, astronomy and literature. The study of Babylon became central to the broader understanding of Mesopotamian civilization. By revealing the depth and complexity of its culture, scholars challenged older images that reduced it to a symbol of sin. Instead, they highlighted its role in shaping mathematics, calendar systems, and imperial administration. Babylon's legacy was thus restored to balance, seen not only through the eyes of its enemies, but also through the evidence of its own achievements. Yet the myths surrounding Babylon remain powerful. The Hanging Gardens continue to capture imagination, even as scholars debate whether they were built in Babylon or elsewhere. The Tower of Babel endures as a story about human ambition and the origin of languages. The biblical image of Babylon as the city of decadence still resonates in sermons and cultural references. These myths coexist with historical knowledge, giving Babylon a dual identity as both real city and symbolic construct. This duality may be the truest expression of its eternal legacy, for Babylon has always been both fact and idea, both place and symbol. The story of Babylon's legacy is therefore one of continuity through transformation. As a living city it rose and fell, but as a memory it endured. Each culture that encountered it reshaped its image, using it to express ideas about empire, morality, and identity. The Judeans saw it as exile, the Greeks as wonder, the Christians as corruption, the Muslims as a place of hidden wisdom, and the modern world as a cradle of civilization. These layers of meaning ensure that Babylon will never truly be forgotten. Its ruins may erode, but its name remains woven into the fabric of human history. In the end, Babylon's eternal legacy lies in its ability to transcend time. It was a city that once ruled empires, but it became more than that, a mirror in which later generations saw their hopes, fears and warnings. Rediscovered in clay tablets, rebuilt in museums, retold in scriptures and reimagined in art, Babylon continues to live. The memory of its walls, its gods, its gardens, and its downfall forms part of humanity's shared heritage. To speak of Babylon is to speak not only of an ancient city on the Euphrates, but of the enduring power of memory itself,